Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Whatever the day left behind, the decisions made without enough information, the ones deferred until tomorrow, the small unresolved things that have no urgency but won't quite go away. You can set all of it down now. The weight of having been available, of having thought through so many things in sequence, doesn't have to come with you into this hour. Morning is patient. It will hold whatever you need to return to. For now, there is only this voice and a story that has been waiting a long time to be told. Tonight, the history begins in Kentucky, in the early years of the 19th century, on a piece of American land that was not quite anyone's yet. A small farm with a single window and a spring that gave it its name, and a family that had already moved once and would move again. From that ground, over 56 years, one of the most documented and most argued over lives in American history slowly took its shape. If this is your first time here, Quiet Chronicles publishes a new episode every week, long histories for the late hours, for the part of the day when the mind is ready to receive something without having to do anything with it. If these episodes have become part of your evenings, it would mean a great deal if you'd subscribe and leave a like. It helps this channel reach the people who need it most. Chapter 1: The Ground That Made Him. Kentucky in the first years of the 19th century was not a place of settled land so much as a place of contested land, a territory that had been a state since 1792, but whose title records were a tangle of overlapping surveys, competing patents, and prior claims that had never been properly cleared. The federal government had not surveyed Kentucky before opening it to settlement the way it would later survey the territories north of the Ohio River. The consequence was a landscape dotted with farms whose owners believed themselves secure and were not. Men had cleared fields and built cabins on ground that a court could take from them years later on the strength of a warrant they had never known existed. This was not an unusual situation in Kentucky. It was the ordinary condition of frontier land tenure. It shaped the lives of a great many people who never understood why their efforts kept coming undone. Thomas Lincoln understood it better than most, because it had happened to him twice. He was born in 1778 in Rockingham County, Virginia, the third son of Abraham Lincoln, a captain in the Virginia militia. He moved his family to Kentucky sometime around 1782, when the land beyond the mountains was beginning to open to settlement, and the promise of it was considerable. The elder Abraham Lincoln did not have long to benefit from that promise. In the spring of 1786, while he was working in a field with his three sons, he was shot by a raiding party and killed. Thomas was 7 or 8 years old. His older brothers Mordecai and Josiah ran. Thomas stood beside his father's body until Mordecai returned with a rifle and drove the attackers off. The detail is small and the record of it fragmentary, but it is the first fact in the family's history. The knowledge, absorbed before the age of 10, that the ground a family worked could be taken from it in a moment, without warning and without remedy. Mordecai Lincoln, as the eldest son, inherited the family's land under Virginia law. Josiah eventually settled in Indiana. Thomas was left to make his own way on the frontier without education, without property, and without a father. He hired himself out as a laborer and carpenter across several Kentucky counties through his teens and early 20s. He was not a failure. He was a competent carpenter and cabinet maker, steady enough in his work that he was known across a reasonably wide area. By his late 20s, he had accumulated enough to make a purchase of his own. In 1803, at approximately 25 years old, he bought a farm on Mill Creek in Hardin County, about 200 acres, with a cabin already on it. He held it for several years before selling it and moving on, and the pattern of that movement would define his relationship to Kentucky land for the next decade. He married Nancy Hanks in June of 1806. She was approximately 22, the daughter of Lucy Hanks. Her origins were not precisely documented even by the standards of the time, a matter that later biographers would spend considerable energy on. What the record shows of Nancy Hanks Lincoln is limited but consistent. She was described by those who knew her as intelligent and gentle. Her appearance was noted in several accounts as dark-haired, thin, with eyes that Lincoln himself was said to resemble. She could read, which was not universal among frontier women of her generation and place. She could not write, which was not unusual. She married Thomas Lincoln in Washington County, Kentucky, and by the time of their first child's birth, she had moved with him to a farm in Elizabethtown. Sarah Lincoln was born in February of 1807. The family was living in Elizabethtown at the time, in a cabin Thomas had built or rented. Sarah's first years were spent there while Thomas continued his carpentry work and looked for land to purchase more permanently. What he found, or believed he had found, was the Sinking Spring Farm. The farm took its name from a limestone spring that emerged from the base of a small cliff near the property's center. It flowed cold and reliable through most seasons of the year. Thomas Lincoln paid $200 for it in December of 1808, 348 acres in Hardin County. It was a substantial parcel by the standards of the region, with the spring as its most valuable feature in a county where water was not always dependable. He built a cabin on the property, one room, a dirt floor, a single window cut into one wall, a stone fireplace at the far end. It was a cabin of the type that thousands of Kentucky frontier families occupied. Not a temporary shelter, but a genuine first structure, meant to be lived in for years while the land was cleared and the farm established. Abraham Lincoln was born in that cabin on February 12, 1809. The title to the Sinking Spring Farm was already compromised. A prior warrant, a land claim filed under Virginia's military grant system predating Thomas Lincoln's purchase, covered a portion of the same ground. The holder of that warrant eventually pressed the claim in court. Thomas Lincoln had not invented or falsified his purchase. He had bought in good faith from a seller who either did not know about the prior claim or did not disclose it. The distinction mattered morally and meant nothing legally. By 1811, facing the prospect of losing the farm through litigation, he lacked the money to contest. Thomas Lincoln moved the family to a second farm. Knob Creek was about 10 miles to the northeast. He had rented rather than purchased, a precaution perhaps learned from what had just happened. Knob Creek was the landscape of Lincoln's earliest memories, the few he would later say he retained. The farm was smaller than Sinking Spring, roughly 230 acres in total. A cultivated field of perhaps 6 acres lay along the bottom land near the creek. The road that ran past it was the main road between Louisville and Nashville, and traffic moved along it with some regularity. Travelers, traders, occasionally a coffle of enslaved people being moved south, the sight of which Lincoln registered even at an early age. The creek flooded periodically, as Kentucky creeks did. One season's planting was washed out entirely. The seeds and seedlings were carried downstream before they had time to take. Thomas Lincoln replanted. The family survived. Abraham Lincoln was between 2 and 8 years old during the Knob Creek years. The farm was the container of his first conscious life. His sister Sarah, 3 years older, was his closest companion. He attended a subscription school briefly, a few months, perhaps, under a teacher named Zachariah Riney, and later another teacher, Caleb Hazel. He learned the rudiments of letters and numbers in the way that frontier schools taught them, by repetition and recitation in a single room with children of several ages. His father was literate enough to sign his name and read simple documents. His mother read to the children from the Bible. The education was thin, but the household was not without language. What Lincoln absorbed in those years was the texture of a life conducted close to the margin, the calculation of seasons, the awareness of what could be lost, the specific patience that poverty requires when it has no immediate remedy. Thomas Lincoln lost the Knob Creek farm in 1816 as well, though the mechanism was different. A prior survey claim overlapped with part of the property's title, a dispute that dragged through the courts without resolution in his favor. He had now lost or been forced off 2 Kentucky farms in 5 years. The land system that was supposed to reward the labor of settlement had twice returned him to where he had begun. He was 38 years old with 2 children and a third farm to find. What he decided was to leave Kentucky entirely. Indiana had been admitted to the Union that same year, 1816. Its land had been surveyed under the federal township and range system before being opened for settlement. A man who purchased a quarter section from the federal land office received a clear title, guaranteed by the government. There was no risk of a prior claim emerging years later to undo everything. The price was $2 per acre, payable in installments over 4 years, for a minimum purchase of 80 acres. It was not cheap, but it was secure. Security was what Thomas Lincoln had not been able to obtain in Kentucky. He crossed the Ohio River in December of 1816, scouted land in Spencer County, and chose a quarter section near a creek called Pigeon Creek. He filed his claim. Then he went back for his family. Abraham Lincoln was 7 years old when they crossed the river. He would not return to Kentucky to live. The Indiana wilderness they were moving into was unbroken forest, dense, cold in December, a landscape without cleared fields or established roads. The first structure Thomas Lincoln built on the Pigeon Creek land was not a cabin, but a half-faced camp. Three walls of logs, one side open to a fire, a temporary shelter against the winter while he worked on something more permanent. The family spent that first winter in it. The temperatures in Spencer County ran well below freezing, and the half-faced camp was what they had. Lincoln's later description of the Indiana years was spare. He said they were hard. He said the forest was heavy. He said there was a good deal of work before there was anything resembling comfort. The work was the daily condition of the household rather than an interruption of it. The sinking spring cabin had been rough, but it had a fireplace and a floor. The half-faced camp had a fire and three walls, and outside those three walls the winter pressed steadily against the opening. The ground that made him was, in the most literal sense, contested ground, land that kept being taken away, or threatening to be taken, or requiring constant labor just to remain on. Thomas Lincoln's reputation has suffered across the centuries under the weight of his famous son's trajectory. He has been flattened into a figure of ineffectual drift. But what the record shows is a man working hard within a system that was systematically stacked against men who lacked capital, losing land not through indolence, but through the operation of a title apparatus that routinely dispossessed frontier farmers. Abraham Lincoln knew this. He did not, in later life, disparage his father in public. He described the conditions his father faced with a factual flatness that was its own kind of clarity. Those conditions were the first facts of Abraham Lincoln's life, present before he had the language for them. The river crossed in December, the three-walled camp in the Indiana cold, the knowledge, too young to be articulated, that the ground a family stood on was not always the ground it would keep. Chapter 2: Indiana and the Milksick. The river crossing had taken them out of Kentucky's contested title system and into something that felt like unbroken cold. Spencer County, Indiana, in the winter of 1816, was forest in the fullest sense. It was not the partially cleared woodland of settled Hardin County, but dense hardwood stands that closed overhead. The December light was reduced to something thin and gray by mid-afternoon. Thomas Lincoln had filed his claim on a quarter section near Pigeon Creek and paid the first installment. He set about making the land habitable with what he had brought and what he could cut from the forest itself. The half-faced camp that sheltered the family through that first winter was three walls of notched logs and a roof of bark. One side was left open to a fire that burned continuously through the coldest weeks. It was not a cabin. It was a structure designed to get a family through a season while a cabin was being built. Thomas Lincoln built the cabin through the same winter he was living in the camp, felling, splitting, and notching. The two projects ran in parallel because there was no other sequence available. Abraham Lincoln was 7, Sarah was 10. Their cousin Dennis Hanks had come with the family. The cold was the ambient condition of every morning. The work was what filled the hours between cold and dark. By spring of 1817, the cabin was standing, one room, but on ground that Thomas Lincoln owned with a federal warranty. He began clearing. The forest gave way slowly, in the way that Indiana hardwood forest always did. acre by acre, stump by stump, the land opening gradually into something that could be planted. Lincoln later recalled that the clearing work seemed to go on continuously through his childhood. There was always more forest at the edge of what had been opened, always another season's worth of stumps to grub out. He did his share of it from an early age, as frontier children did, not as a hardship, but as the simple arithmetic of survival. The farm took shape across 1817 and into 1818. A second structure went up, a smokehouse or a separate sleeping space. The accounts differ. The cleared acreage expanded enough to allow a planted field of reasonable size. Neighbors had settled within a few miles, the Gentrys, the Bruners, and the Sparrows. Thomas and Elizabeth Sparrow, Nancy Lincoln's aunt and uncle, had followed the family from Kentucky. The settlement around Pigeon Creek was thin and scattered, but it was present. The presence of the Sparrows meant that the Lincoln household had family within reach. The nearest town of any size was Vincennes, 60 miles to the west. The autumn of 1818 arrived with what the settlers called milk sickness, though they did not know its cause. The illness spread through livestock first. Cattle ranging in the forest would eat white snake root, a plant that grew abundantly in the undergrowth. The toxin tremetal passed through the milk and meat of affected animals into the people who consumed them. The symptoms in humans were distinctive: weakness and trembling in the limbs, a severe and persistent vomiting. There was a white coating on the tongue, a prostration that deepened over days rather than resolving. Those who contracted it badly did not always recover. The settlers understood that something in the environment was killing people with some regularity, but the specific mechanism would not be identified with certainty for another generation. In 1818, it was simply a thing that came in autumn and took people. The autumn of 1818 took several in the Pigeon Creek settlement. Thomas and Elizabeth Sparrow sickened first, in September, and died within days of each other. Nancy Lincoln went to nurse them and contracted the illness herself. She took to the pegged board bed in the cabin's single room in early October and did not rise from it again. She was 34 years old. She died on October 5, 1818. Thomas Lincoln and the two children were in the room, in the cabin they had built together. There was no preacher within practical reach. Thomas Lincoln built the coffin from green oak planks, working in the days immediately after her death. He hauled it by sled to a hillside site about a quarter-mile from the cabin. The grave was marked with a wooden stake. There was no service beyond what the family could provide for itself. The record of what was said, if anything was said, has not survived. Abraham Lincoln was 9 years old. Sarah was 12. What followed was a winter of considerable bleakness, even by the standards of the previous 2 years. Thomas Lincoln continued the farm work because it could not be stopped. Animals needed feeding, wood needed cutting. The minimum maintenance of survival required daily attention. Sarah Lincoln, at 12, took over the household management that her mother had carried. The cooking, the cleaning, the care of the younger children. She organized a domestic space that had lost its organizing figure. Dennis Hanks remained with the family and helped where he could. Lincoln later described that winter in terms that suggest a period of particular difficulty, but the emotional register of his later references to his mother was always measured. He spoke of her intelligence and her gentleness, of what she had given him in the brief years he had with her. He did not use the extended grief that biographers sometimes projected onto him. In the late autumn of 1819, Thomas Lincoln rode back to Kentucky. He went to Elizabethtown and called on Sarah Bush Johnston, a widow with 3 children. Her husband had died the previous year, leaving her with debts and a household to manage. Thomas Lincoln had known her before his marriage to Nancy Hanks. He proposed to her directly and settled Johnston's debts as part of the arrangement. They married on December 6, 1819. He was back in Indiana with his new wife and her 3 children within weeks. Sarah Bush Lincoln arrived at the Pigeon Creek cabin and was dismayed by its condition. The floor was dirt. The walls had gaps that the winter came through. The children were dirty and inadequately clothed. She had brought with her a wagon loaded with furniture, a bureau, a table, a set of chairs. It was the first substantial domestic furnishings the Lincoln cabin had ever contained. She set about using them to transform the space with a thoroughness that suggested she understood what the previous year had been. Thomas Lincoln put a wooden floor in the cabin. He chinked the walls. He added a sleeping loft accessible by pegs driven into the wall. The household became, in a matter of weeks, 2 adults and 5 children. The crowding was considerable, but the crowding came with warmth and order. Sarah Bush Lincoln's relationship with Abraham is one of the better documented step-parent relationships in history. She lived long enough to be interviewed after the assassination. Her testimony was consistent and detailed. She said that Abraham was the best boy she had ever known, not the most obedient, but the most intellectually alive. He was the one who would read anything that came into the house and remember it. She said she loved him as her own. She understood, watching him as a boy, that he was not made for the farm in the way the neighbors were. His energy went somewhere else, into the books and the words and the arguments. She encouraged this rather than redirecting it toward the work that needed doing. What is clear is that she created the conditions for what he would become. The Pigeon Creek farm in the early 1820s was a functioning frontier household. It was not prosperous, but it was stable. The land was cleared to a workable extent. The crops were adequate in most years. Lincoln grew rapidly, and as he grew, he read. He carried books borrowed from neighbors across distances that were later remembered as considerable. He read by firelight in the evenings when the work was done. He copied passages onto a wooden board when he had no paper. What the Indiana years gave him was a specific relationship to loss. Not a broken or embittered relationship, but a calibrated one. He had watched his mother die, his aunt and uncle die, and the neighbors thin out through illness. He had seen his father rebuild twice after losing everything. The lesson was not that loss could be prevented. It was that life continued past it. and that continuation required the same daily effort. Sarah Lincoln's death in January of 1828 would confirm this. She was 21 years old, and she died in childbirth, the child lost as well. Lincoln was 18. He carved a wooden marker for her grave with his own hands. He was devastated, quietly, in the way that people are when the person most like them is gone. He continued working the farm through that spring because the spring planting did not wait. He arranged for a preacher to come and give Sarah a proper service that she had not been able to have. And later that same year, 1828, Denton Offutt arrived in the settlement. He was looking for young men willing to take a flatboat to New Orleans. Chapter 3: The Education of a Self-Made Mind. Denton Offutt was the kind of man the frontier produced in some numbers: entrepreneurial, voluble, better at proposing ventures than sustaining them, always with a new scheme requiring the labor of someone younger and more reliable than himself. He needed flatboatmen to take a cargo of farm produce and barreled pork down the Sangamon River to the Illinois River, then south on the Mississippi to New Orleans, where the goods would be sold and the men would make their way back north. He was offering wages. Lincoln was 18, newly relieved of the immediate obligations of farm work by the flatboat's departure date, and he said yes. The journey down to New Orleans in the spring of 1828 was Lincoln's first extended departure from the world he had always known. The first time he had traveled beyond the radius of Indiana counties, the first time he had seen a city of any size, the first time he had moved through the wider commercial geography of the American interior. The flatboat carried its cargo at the pace of the current, which was unhurried. The weeks on the river gave Lincoln a view of the Mississippi Valley that no amount of reading could have provided. The width of the river south of its confluences, the plantation landscape of the lower South appearing gradually as they moved below the Ohio's mouth, the traffic on the water thickening as they approached New Orleans. New Orleans in 1828 was the largest city in the South and the fourth largest in the country. A port city of approximately 40,000 people built at the river's crescent bend. Its commerce organized almost entirely around the produce of the interior arriving by flatboat and keelboat, and the goods of the Atlantic world arriving by ocean vessel. The levee, the raised embankment along the river's edge, was the city's commercial spine. It was there, by the account Lincoln's companion John Hanks gave decades later, that the two young men from Indiana encountered a slave auction. The specifics of what Hanks described are worth holding carefully, because the account came long after the fact. It carried the weight of retrospective significance that eyewitness testimony tends to accumulate over time. What Hanks said was that they saw enslaved people, a family, in his telling, or a group being sold on the levee. Lincoln watched it with an expression and a stillness that Hanks remembered as different from ordinary discomfort. Hanks said Lincoln turned away and said something to the effect that if he ever got a chance to hit that thing, he would hit it hard. The exact words are not certain. Hanks was recalling a conversation from 30 years earlier when he gave his account to Herndon. What is certain is that Lincoln had seen the slave trade operating in its ordinary commercial form, not as an abstraction, not as a political question, but as a transaction conducted on a public wharf in daylight with the efficiency of any other commerce. This was not the last time the sight of it would stay with him. They returned to Indiana by steamboat, the conventional return route for flat boatmen who had sold their cargo and their vessel downstream. Lincoln was paid for his work, returned to the Pigeon Creek farm, and spent the next 3 years doing what the farm required. While the thing he had always done in the margins of farm life, reading, thinking, arguing, continued to occupy whatever time was left. The books available to him were not many, and the distances he traveled to obtain them were not small. He had read Weems's Life of Washington so many times that the pages had softened at the edges from handling. The story of Washington's honesty and his refusal of a crown had lodged in Lincoln's imagination at an age when such stories go deep and stay. Aesop's fables he knew by heart in the way that children who read the same book dozens of times know things by heart, not as a memorized recitation, but as an absorbed grammar of how arguments work, how a short narrative can carry a moral without announcing it. Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress he had worked through carefully. The King James Bible was as familiar to him as any text he owned, which was the ordinary condition of a Protestant frontier household, where the Bible was frequently the first and sometimes the only book in the house. What distinguished Lincoln from other readers was not the books he had access to. Those were broadly the same books any family might own, but what he did with them afterward. He copied passages onto wooden boards and later onto paper when he could get it, not to memorize them, but to examine how they were built, how a sentence moved from its opening to its close, how a paragraph held an argument together, how the rhythm of language affected the weight of what was being said. He worked out arguments aloud, to whoever was present, in the way that a person does when thinking is inseparable from speaking. He read the Revised Statutes of Indiana, a legal code borrowed from a neighbor named David Turnham, not because he was planning to become a lawyer, but because the language of law was a new kind of precision that interested him, a form of argument in which the exact words mattered in ways they did not in ordinary speech. Mentor Graham enters the story slightly later in New Salem, but his significance belongs here because he gave formal shape to habits Lincoln had already formed. Graham was the schoolmaster at New Salem when Lincoln arrived there in 1831, a man of genuine education by frontier standards, and he recognized in Lincoln something he did not often encounter, a student who had already learned to learn, who needed not instruction in the basics, but a companion in the refinements. Graham taught Lincoln the rudiments of formal grammar, lent him books on rhetoric and logic, and functioned for several years as his closest intellectual mentor. The relationship mattered not because Graham gave Lincoln his education, but because he confirmed and extended what Lincoln had built largely without help. The second flatboat journey to New Orleans came in the spring of 1831, and Denton Offutt was again involved. Offutt's promises were again involved, since he had proposed a new venture and needed men to staff it. Lincoln went, along with his cousin John Hanks and his stepbrother John Johnston. The journey was longer and more eventful than the first. The flatboat ran aground on a mill dam at the village of New Salem, Illinois. The young men spent a day managing the crisis before Lincoln devised a solution, offloading part of the cargo to lighten the boat, boring a hole in the bow to drain water that had entered, pivoting the vessel off the dam. The people of New Salem watched from the bank. Denton Offutt, who happened to be among the observers, was impressed enough to offer Lincoln a job managing a store he intended to open. This second New Orleans journey deepened what the first had begun. Lincoln was 22 now, and he moved through the city's commercial world with more capacity to understand what he was seeing. The cotton economy of the lower Mississippi Valley was, by 1831, the dominant economic system of the American South. The production organized around enslaved labor, the commerce organized around the river, the wealth of New Orleans built on the transformation of human labor into baled fiber. Lincoln saw this operating at full scale. He was not an abolitionist at 22. It would be historically inaccurate to project the convictions of his 40s onto the observations of his early 20s. But the river journeys gave him something that the Indiana farm could not have provided: direct, sustained, first-hand acquaintance with the system the Republic had been built around. He returned from New Orleans in the early summer of 1831 and did not go back to Indiana. Denton Offutt's offer of a job in New Salem was the immediate reason for staying in Illinois. But the deeper reason was that Lincoln had been ready to leave the farm for some time. He was 22 years old. He had been doing farm work since he was old enough to be useful, and he had never found it interesting. Not because the work was beneath him, but because it did not engage the part of him that was most alive: the law, the language, the argument, the political world he had been reading about since he was old enough to follow a newspaper. These were where his attention went when it was free to go anywhere. His father did not understand this, or understood it, and found it difficult. Thomas Lincoln's relationship with his son's ambitions was complicated by the practical fact that a grown son was a labor resource, and by the emotional fact that Abraham's interests had always pointed away from everything Thomas Lincoln had spent his life building. The parting was not dramatic, by the accounts available. Lincoln left the Pigeon Creek farm in the spring of 1831 with Denton Offutt's venture as his stated purpose. He did not return to live there. He sent money to his father in later years, paid debts Thomas Lincoln could not cover, and visited when circumstances permitted. The relationship between them was dutiful rather than warm, and Lincoln rarely discussed it. What he carried away from the Indiana years was less visible than what he had acquired through reading, but no less consequential. He carried the physical endurance of a man who had been doing hard outdoor labor since childhood. The long reach, the easy strength, the comfort with tools and animals, and the material world that would serve him in New Salem. He carried the patience of someone who had learned to wait for conditions to improve without expecting them to improve on any schedule. And he carried the specific understanding that came from having grown up in poverty, that was not shameful but simply present. a familiarity with scarcity that gave him an ability to speak to and about ordinary working people without condescension and without performance. New Salem was a village of approximately 150 people on a bluff above the Sangamon River. Denton Offutt's store was not yet open when Lincoln arrived. He spent several weeks helping to build it, learning the layout of the village, and introducing himself to the population. A place that would shape the next 6 years of his life more completely than any other single location outside of Springfield. The store opened. Lincoln began working it, and the village of New Salem began to take his measure in the way that small frontier communities took the measure of newcomers. Through competition, through conversation, and through the particular test that New Salem's dominant social faction had developed for young men. Chapter 4: New Salem. The Clary's Grove Boys were not a formal organization. They were a loose confederation of young men from the farming settlement a few miles outside New Salem, led by Jack Armstrong. Armstrong functioned as their unofficial champion in the way that frontier communities organized physical dominance. Through wrestling, through feats of strength, through the social performance of toughness used to establish hierarchy among young men. They were not criminals. Most of them were hard-working farmers who spent their leisure time testing each other, and, when the opportunity arose, testing newcomers. A new young man arriving in New Salem with Denton Offutt's enthusiastic endorsements was exactly the kind of opportunity they looked for. Offutt had been telling anyone who would listen that his new store clerk was the strongest man in the county. This was the kind of claim that required demonstration, and Jack Armstrong was the instrument of demonstration. The match between Armstrong and Lincoln drew a crowd from both the village and the surrounding farms. The accounts that survived differ on the outcome in ways that are themselves instructive. Some said Lincoln threw Armstrong cleanly. Some said Armstrong broke the rules of the hold and Lincoln, angered, challenged the entire group to fight him together. Some said the match was called a draw by mutual agreement. What all the accounts agree on is that Lincoln acquitted himself in a way that left no one inclined to challenge him again, and that Armstrong's response was not resentment, but respect, a respect that curdled into genuine friendship over the following months and years. The friendship with Armstrong mattered more than the wrestling match that produced it. Jack Armstrong and the Clary's Grove Boys became, in effect, Lincoln's social infrastructure in New Salem, the network of men who vouched for him to the broader community, who showed up when he needed help, who turned out to vote for him in his first campaign. Armstrong's wife Hannah would later nurse Lincoln through an illness. Lincoln would later defend their son Duff Armstrong at a murder trial, using an almanac to impeach a witness's claim about the position of the moon. The connection that began as a physical contest ran for the rest of Lincoln's New Salem years and beyond. Formed quickly, through direct encounter, and held by the memory of that encounter long after the circumstances had changed. Denton Offutt's store, meanwhile, proved to be approximately what one might have expected from a venture organized by Denton Offutt. The merchandise was inconsistent, the supply lines unreliable, the owner's attention frequently elsewhere. Lincoln managed it competently through 1831 and into 1832, but the store was failing as a commercial proposition from early on. When Offutt drifted away from the village, as Offutt characteristically drifted away from things, the store went with him. Lincoln was left in New Salem without regular employment. The condition that opened the next several years of his life to a variety of occupations that would have seemed rather scattered. He had by this point established himself in the village through means that had nothing to do with the store. He read everything that came through New Salem, newspapers, legal documents, whatever books the village's small community could provide. He argued politics and law and scripture at the store counter and at James Rutledge's tavern. He had found, in Bowling Green, the justice of the peace for the area, a large, good-humored man of genuine intelligence, something like the companionship Mentor Graham had provided. Green lent Lincoln law books and invited him to observe the proceedings of his justice court. Lincoln watched those proceedings with the attention of someone who was learning by watching rather than by being taught. The Black Hawk War arrived in the spring of 1832, a conflict along the northern Illinois and Wisconsin frontier. A struggle between United States forces and a coalition of Sauk and Fox people led by the chief Black Hawk. Governor Reynolds called for volunteers. New Salem organized a company, and the company elected its captain by the method frontier militia companies used. The men formed two lines behind the candidates they preferred, and the longer line determined the outcome. Lincoln's line was longer. He later said that no subsequent success gave him quite the satisfaction of that election. The direct, unmediated judgment of men who knew him personally, choosing him over another candidate by standing behind him. His military service in the Black Hawk War lasted approximately 3 months and was, in military terms, entirely uneventful. His company marched north, camped, marched again, and encountered no combat. Lincoln's later jokes about his service, that his only battles had been against mosquitoes, were the self-deprecating humor of a man who understood glory. He saw no point in pretending otherwise. What the service gave him was practical, a network of acquaintances across Illinois, and the experience of managing a group of men who had not volunteered to be managed. A brief absence from New Salem that, when he returned, made him more aware of how much he had come to regard it as home. He returned to find that the store was gone and that he had no immediate means of support. He also returned to find that the date of the legislative election was approaching. Several people had suggested he stand as a candidate for the Illinois General Assembly from Sangamon County. Lincoln announced his candidacy in March 1832 before leaving for the Black Hawk campaign. It was a careful document that laid out his views on internal improvements, on education, and on the importance of navigating the Sangamon River. The statement argued from the listener's material interests rather than from abstract principle. He spoke as if he understood the listener's circumstances because he shared them. He lost. Of the 13 candidates running for 4 seats, Lincoln finished 8th. Given that he was unknown outside the New Salem area and had been away for 3 months, it was not a disgrace, but was clearly a loss. What the vote showed was that within New Salem itself, Lincoln had run very well. 277 of the 300 votes cast in the precinct went to him. He filed the outcome away and began looking for the next thing. The next thing was co-ownership of a store. Lincoln and a man named William Barry bought out the inventory of a failing store in late 1832 and went into business together. Barry had a taste for the store's whiskey supply that was incompatible with running a store profitably. Lincoln's interest in being behind a counter was limited under any circumstances. The store, in Lincoln's later description, winked out. Barry died in 1835, leaving the debts of their partnership in Lincoln's name. Lincoln spent the better part of a decade paying them off, what he called the national debt. In the meantime, he had been appointed postmaster of New Salem in May 1833. The salary was negligible, but the position was valuable for different reasons. As postmaster, Lincoln had legitimate access to every newspaper that arrived in New Salem before it reached its subscriber. The newspapers were his education in national politics. In the debates over the bank, over tariffs, over slavery's expansion, he absorbed this coverage with systematic attention. By the mid-1830s, he was as well informed about national political affairs as anyone in Sangamon County. He had also become the unofficial surveyor's assistant for the area, working with John Calhoun on the measurement and mapping of land claims, which required him to learn mathematical techniques quickly. The work put him in contact with farmers and landowners across the county in a way that no other occupation could have arranged. By the time of the 1834 legislative election, Lincoln was known personally and favorably by a significant portion of the men who would be voting. He ran again in 1834, and this time he won, second of 4 seats, with 1,376 votes. He was 25 years old. He was about to travel to Vandalia for the first session of the legislature with $60 borrowed from a friend. What he found in Vandalia confirmed and deepened everything he had been preparing for. The legislature was a working political institution with its factions and its trades and its long afternoons of maneuvering. Lincoln moved through it with the attentiveness of a man who understood he was learning something unique. John Todd Stewart, a Whig legislator from Springfield, took an interest in the new member from New Salem. Stewart suggested that Lincoln study law seriously, with a view to practicing it. He offered the use of his law library. Lincoln accepted and began riding the 40 miles between New Salem and Springfield on borrowed horses to read. The education that had begun on a Kentucky farm with a borrowed copy of Aesop was arriving at something that would sustain the rest of his life. Chapter 5: The Shape of Loss. John Todd Stewart's law library was not the only thing the Springfield trips provided. The road between New Salem and Springfield ran through a landscape that Lincoln was learning in the way a surveyor learns a landscape, not as scenery, but as a set of measurable relationships between points, distances that could be walked or ridden and that had a specific character in each season. The 40 miles took the better part of a day on horseback. Lincoln made the trip often enough through 1834 and 1835 that the road became familiar in the way that repeated journeys make things familiar. Less a route than a rhythm, the mind freed by the body's routine to work on whatever it was carrying. What it was carrying, through much of 1835, was the law books Stewart had lent him, Blackstone's commentaries chief among them. Lincoln read them with the same method he had applied to everything else, slowly, repeatedly, arguing with the text in the margins of his own comprehension, until the argument was his rather than the book's. Anne Rutledge was the daughter of James Rutledge, who had co-founded New Salem and operated the tavern that served as the village's social center. She was 22 in the summer of 1835, engaged to a man named John McNamar who had left New Salem for New York in 1832. His letters arrived with decreasing frequency, then stopping. The engagement existed more as a stated obligation than as a present relationship by the time Anne Rutledge became ill in the summer of 1835. The illness was a fever, the specific type unrecorded, and it moved quickly. She died on August 25, 1835. What Lincoln's relationship with Anne Rutledge actually was has been argued about since Herndon first raised it publicly in a lecture in 1866. A year after Lincoln's death, he described it as the great love of Lincoln's life and attributed to her death the melancholy that defined Lincoln's character. The evidence for a romantic attachment is real but limited. Accounts from New Salem neighbors were collected years after the fact, consistent in their assertion that Lincoln visited her frequently. They were inconsistent in their details about the nature of what had existed between them while she was alive. What the record shows with reasonable clarity is this: Lincoln knew her well, cared for her genuinely in whatever form that caring took. Her death in August of 1835 produced in him a response that frightened his neighbors. Mentor Graham, the New Salem schoolmaster, told Herndon that Lincoln came to him in the weeks after Anne's death in a state of mind that Graham had never seen. Unfocused, unable to work, carrying a grief that seemed to have no bottom. Other New Salem residents described similar observations. Lincoln wandering along the river, absent from his usual routines, saying things that suggested he was not entirely certain he wished to continue. The community response was practical. Friends kept him in company. Bowling Green and his wife Nancy took Lincoln into their home for several weeks, feeding him and providing the specific comfort of a household. The intervention worked, in the sense that Lincoln returned to his routines, continued his law reading, continued his work as postmaster and surveyor. But those who knew him noted that something had settled into him that had not been there before: a gravity, a tendency toward long silences, a darkness that would visit him throughout his life with varying degrees of severity. He was admitted to the Illinois bar in September 1836. He had passed the informal examination that constituted bar admission at the time, a conversation with a sitting judge. Lincoln understood considerably more than enough. Stewart had seen this during the legislative sessions in Vandalia, where Lincoln's ability to grasp the legal dimensions of questions had been apparent. The formal admission to practice was less a threshold than a confirmation of what was already true. The move to Springfield came in April 1837. New Salem was dying. The town had never quite found the commercial foundation it needed, and the decision to route the railroad through Petersburg had sealed its fate. The population was dispersing to larger towns, and Lincoln had been preparing to disperse with it. He arrived in Springfield on a borrowed horse, carrying everything he owned in two saddlebags. He rode directly to the store of Joshua Speed. Speed was 23 years old, a Kentuckian of good family who had come to Springfield to make his way in the dry goods trade. Lincoln introduced himself and asked the price of bedding sufficient to furnish a room. He calculated that he could not afford it without going further into debt, and said so with a directness that Speed found unusual. Speed told Lincoln he had a large room upstairs with a double bed. He told him he was welcome to share it if he wished, and that no money needed to change hands. Lincoln carried his saddlebags up the stairs, looked at the room, came back down, and told Speed that he had moved in. He lived above Speed's store for the next several years, sharing the bed with Speed and occasionally with other young men. It was a common frontier manner of domestic arrangements where privacy was a luxury rather than a standard. The Speed friendship was the most important of Lincoln's adult life to that point. Speed was intelligent, emotionally perceptive, and temperamentally suited to the specific kind of friendship that Lincoln needed. Someone who could receive Lincoln's interior life without being overwhelmed by it, who could argue with him without competitiveness, who could sit in the same room reading without requiring conversation. They talked at length, in the evenings above the store, about everything that interested them: law, politics, poetry, the nature of ambition, the question of what a man owed to himself and what he owed to the world. Lincoln read poetry to Speed, and Speed read it back. The specific texts they shared, Burns, Byron, Shakespeare, became part of the private language of their friendship. The law partnership with Stuart was established in April 1837, simultaneous with the Springfield move. Stuart and Lincoln practiced together out of a small office near the courthouse, handling the range of cases that came to a general practice: land disputes, debt collections, criminal defenses, commercial contracts. Lincoln rode the 8th Judicial Circuit with Stuart, traveling the county seats of central Illinois twice a year. He spent his time sleeping in taverns and spare rooms, arguing cases in courthouses that were sometimes barely completed buildings. He was developing the practical fluency in law that no amount of reading could have provided. The Mary Owens interlude belongs to this period. It is worth examining not for its romantic significance, but for what it reveals about Lincoln's self-awareness. Mary Owens was a well-educated Kentucky woman whom Lincoln had met in 1833. She was attractive, intelligent, and considerably more socially accomplished than Lincoln. Mrs. Abell suggested that if Mary Owens were to come back to Illinois, Lincoln and she might make a match of it. Lincoln agreed, also somewhat playfully. Mary Owens came back in 1836. What followed was a courtship of unusual awkwardness. It was sustained by a sense of obligation on Lincoln's part that he was honest enough to examine and uncertain enough to act on badly. He wrote her letters during 1836 and 1837 that are striking documents, frank, self deprecating, and genuinely strange. He told her the city might not suit her. He told her that if she did not wish to fulfill the understanding between them, he would not hold her to it. He was saying this not from a desire to be released, but from a genuine concern for her happiness. He told her he suspected he was not well suited to make a woman happy. Mary Owens declined the informal engagement with a directness that matched Lincoln's own. She later told an interviewer that she had found Lincoln deficient in the small attentions that women expected from suitors. He had, on one occasion, ridden ahead on a horse rather than helping her across a difficult creek crossing. This had told her something about what daily life with him might involve. Lincoln's response was a letter to a friend, Mrs. Orville Browning, in which he described the entire episode with self-mockery. He wrote that he had expected to feel relieved at being released. Instead, he felt a peculiar embarrassment at having been rejected by a woman he had been uncertain about. The letter reveals a man who did not yet know how to be in an intimate relationship without hedging every commitment. Stuart's congressional ambitions were moving toward a campaign for the House of Representatives in 1838. This meant the law partnership was operating with increasing distraction. Lincoln carried more of the practice's weight than the partnership's nominal structure suggested. The experience of doing so confirmed that he was a genuinely capable lawyer. His courtroom style was developing along lines that would mark it permanently. Plain language, logical sequencing. He avoided the ornate rhetorical flourishes that contemporary legal argument often deployed. He had a talent for the well-placed story that reset a jury's attention without appearing to manipulate it. He won cases he should have lost, and occasionally lost cases he should have won. The ratio was favorable enough that his reputation in the Eighth Circuit was growing steadily. Joshua Speed sold his store in 1841 and returned to Kentucky. The departure was the occasion for a correspondence that is among the most emotionally direct writing Lincoln produced. Speed was engaged to Fanny Henning and was suffering from pre-commitment anxiety. Lincoln wrote him letters of remarkable candor, reassuring Speed, analyzing his doubts. He was doing for his friend what no one had quite been able to do for him. The letters suggest a man who understood intimacy better in theory than in practice. He was using Speed's situation as both a genuine act of friendship and a rehearsal for something he had not yet managed. What he had not yet managed was Mary Todd. Chapter 6: The Illinois Legislature and the Making of a Politician. Mary Todd had arrived in Springfield in 1839, but the Illinois General Assembly had been educating Lincoln in the practical arts of politics since 1834. The education was worth examining on its own terms before the two threads met. The legislature that Lincoln entered as a 25-year-old was a working institution of roughly 80 men, farmers, lawyers, merchants, a few doctors. They brought with them the full range of competence and venality and genuine public spirit. Lincoln watched it carefully from the beginning. the way he watched everything he found worth learning. He was learning something harder to name and more immediately useful: the specific grammar of how political will gets translated into result. The Whig Party was Lincoln's natural home from the beginning of his political life. Henry Clay's American system appealed to Lincoln with the force of personal experience. Internal improvements funded by the federal government, a protective tariff, and a national bank to stabilize currency and credit. He had grown up in precisely the conditions that Clay's program was designed to address: isolated from markets, unable to get crops to buyers efficiently, dependent on a monetary system so chaotic that a farmer could be paid in currency that was worth less by the time he spent it. The Whig program was not abstract to Lincoln. It was a description of what had been missing from his father's world, rendered in the language of national policy. The internal improvements debate dominated the Illinois legislature through Lincoln's first 2 terms. He threw himself into it with an energy that distinguished him from members who treated sessions as an obligation. The state was attempting to fund an ambitious program of canal and railroad construction. The financing required a series of bond issuances and appropriations that needed to be assembled and defended. Lincoln was not the senior member of the Whig caucus in this effort, but he was among the most active, tracking votes, negotiating with wavering members, understanding the mechanics well enough to explain them to colleagues. The Long Nine emerged from this context. Sangamon County's legislative delegation in the 1836–1837 session consisted of 9 members. All were Whigs and all stood over 6 feet tall, a coincidence that the Vandalia newspapers found amusing. Lincoln, at 6 feet 4, was the tallest. By the 1836 session, he was also the delegation's most politically sophisticated member. The Long Nine voted as a block on the question that mattered most: the location of the state capital. Vandalia had been the capital since statehood, but it was poorly situated for the state's growing population. Springfield, in Sangamon County, was arguing its case as a more central and accessible location. The decision would be made by coalition. Coalition building was what Lincoln had been studying. The strategy he and the Sangamon delegation employed was straightforward in principle and demanding in execution. They would trade their votes on improvements projects elsewhere for support of Springfield as the new capital. This required identifying which members were movable, what they needed in exchange, and whether commitments would hold. Lincoln managed the floor work with a patience and a precision that his colleagues noted, knowing which man to approach and when, keeping the count accurate through a process that ran across multiple sessions. The vote to move the capital to Springfield passed in February 1837. The Long Nine celebrated at a Springfield tavern with a party that cost approximately $200. The move established Lincoln's reputation across the state's Whig network as a man who could organize a political result. This reputation would matter when larger coalitions needed to be assembled in later years. Stephen Douglas entered Lincoln's political world during these same legislative sessions. Douglas was younger than Lincoln by 4 years, shorter by nearly a foot, and in possession of a combativeness the Democrats found useful. Where Lincoln worked by patience and indirection, Douglas worked by force and volume, arguing from the floor with a directness that sometimes won votes through sheer rhetorical pressure. They were not enemies in the Vandalia years, but they were opponents in the structural sense. Lincoln the Whig floor manager, Douglas the rising Democratic talent, each learning the other's methods. John J. Hardin was a Whig colleague of Lincoln's who would become both an ally and a rival, a man of genuine ability and military bearing who represented a different wing of the Illinois Whig Party. Edward D. Baker was another Whig legislator of this era, volatile, eloquent, prone to dramatic gestures. Lincoln watched him with the attention of someone who understood their effect without sharing their temperament. Orville Browning, a Whig from Quincy, was among the more measured of Lincoln's legislative relationships. A lawyer of careful habits and conservative instincts who would remain in Lincoln's orbit for decades. Browning's diary provides some of the most useful records of Lincoln's thinking during this period. The legislature also gave Lincoln his first experience of the slavery question as a political matter. In 1837, the legislature passed resolutions condemning abolitionist societies. They affirmed the constitutional right to hold enslaved people in the slave states. Lincoln and one other member, Dan Stone, filed a formal protest against these resolutions. It was a careful statement that the institution of slavery was founded on both injustice and bad policy. The protest was notable for what it showed about Lincoln's method. He was unwilling to affirm what he believed to be false, but he was also unwilling to position himself as an abolitionist. The protest threaded a needle that required both honesty and precision. His fourth and final legislative term ended in 1842, by which point he had made the decision to concentrate on law and on a congressional race. The legislature had given him what he needed: the network, the reputation, the practical education in how power moved. His law practice was growing. His Springfield social world had expanded. And in the fall of 1840, at a cotillion dance, he had met Mary Todd. The legislature's most lasting gift was the habit of mind that 4 terms of floor work had produced. The ability to hold a complicated count in his head across an extended period, to know when to press and when to wait, and to keep the ultimate objective in view. These were not skills that had obvious applications in a law office. They had very obvious applications everywhere else. Chapter 7: Mary Todd and the Washington Congress. The Edwards household on Aristocracy Hill, the elevated neighborhood where Springfield's more prosperous families had built their substantial houses, was the social center of the Illinois Whig world. Ninian Edwards and his wife Elizabeth were its presiding figures. Elizabeth Todd Edwards was Mary Todd's older sister. It was to this household that Mary had come in 1839 from Lexington, Kentucky. She had been educated at Madame Montel's boarding school in the French language, in literature, and in the social accomplishments the Kentucky planter class considered essential. She was 21 when she arrived in Springfield. She was fluent in French, widely read, and politically opinionated in ways that surprised men who had not expected opinions from a young woman at a cotillion. She possessed a wit that was quick enough to be either charming or cutting, depending on how the conversation was going. Lincoln was introduced to her in the winter of 1839 or 1840. The accounts of their early conversations suggest a mutual recognition of unusual intensity. He told her he wanted to dance with her in the worst way. She later joked that he had indeed danced in the worst way. He was 31, already well known in Springfield's legal and political circles. He was visibly ambitious and visibly unpolished in the ways that Ninian Edwards's social world measured polish. She was 22, far better educated in the formal sense, and from a more prominent family. She was apparently undisturbed by the gap between his social origins and hers, in a way that disturbed some of her relatives considerably. The courtship that followed was not smooth. The Edwardses had reservations. Ninian Edwards thought him a capable politician, but an unsuitable match for a Todd of Kentucky. Lincoln was not wealthy enough, not sufficiently refined, and lacked the social standing that the family expected its connections to carry. Elizabeth Edwards shared these reservations and expressed them with the directness of an older sister. Mary Todd did not appear to find these arguments persuasive, which was consistent with her character. The engagement collapsed in January of 1841, what Lincoln referred to as the fatal 1st of January. The precise cause of the break is not recorded with certainty. Lincoln apparently told Mary Todd that he was releasing her from any obligation, or communicated his uncertainty in some form that amounted to the same thing. His own accounts describe a state of psychological collapse, what he called the hypo. It was severe enough that Speed and others were worried. He wrote to Stuart that he was the most miserable man living, and that if what he felt were equally distributed, there would not be one cheerful face on earth. He could not practice law. He could barely function. The legislature was in session, and he attended it without enthusiasm, going through the motions while something interior had gone very quiet. Joshua Speed's departure for Kentucky in 1841 and the correspondence that followed produced the mechanism through which Lincoln worked his way back. Speed married Fanny Henning in February 1842. He reported that the marriage had brought him happiness rather than the catastrophe his anxieties had predicted. Lincoln received this news with the attention of a man for whom it carried direct personal relevance. He and Mary Todd resumed contact in the late summer of 1842. They met quietly at the home of a mutual friend, Simeon Francis, whose wife had arranged the encounter without informing the Edwardses. The resumption was gradual, then conclusive. They married on November 4th, 1842, in the Edwards parlor, a ceremony arranged on short notice. The ring was gold, inscribed with the words, "Love is eternal." He was 33. She was 23. Robert Todd Lincoln was born on August 1st, 1843, in a rented room at the Globe Tavern. This was a practical arrangement that reflected the financial reality of a lawyer whose practice was not yet prosperous. The Lincolns bought a house on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets in 1844. It was a story and a half cottage that they would expand and improve over the following years. Edward Baker Lincoln arrived on March 10th, 1846. The household was acquiring the shape of an ordinary Springfield professional family's life. There were specific complications that came from combining Lincoln's long absences on the circuit with Mary Todd's management of the household. Her own sharp political intelligence found limited outlet in the social world available to her. Lincoln won the Whig nomination for the 7th Congressional District seat in 1846. He navigated the district's informal rotation agreement with the careful attention to sequence he had learned in the legislature. Hardin had gone first, then Baker. Lincoln's turn had arrived. When Hardin attempted to reopen the agreement, Lincoln outmaneuvered him in the district's county conventions with thoroughness. He won the general election against the Democrat Peter Cartwright, a Methodist circuit preacher, by a comfortable margin. They arrived in Washington in December 1847. The Lincolns and their two small boys took rooms in a boarding house on Carroll Row, operated by a Mrs. Ann Sprigg. The boarding house was populated largely by Whig members of Congress, which made it a functioning political community as well as a residence. Mary Todd found the boarding house cramped and the Washington social world less welcoming than she had anticipated. She took the boys to her family in Lexington in the spring of 1848, leaving Lincoln to finish his single term without them. The spot resolutions were the most consequential act of Lincoln's congressional term and the most politically costly. President Polk had asked Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico in May 1846. He asserted that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. Lincoln had voted for the war's funding because refusing to fund troops already in the field was politically untenable. But the underlying assertion that the blood had been shed on American soil he believed to be false. In December 1847, he introduced a series of resolutions demanding that Polk identify the exact spot of American soil where the first blood had been shed. The specific speech Lincoln delivered on December 26, 1847, was a carefully built constitutional argument. It focused on the limits of executive power to initiate war. Lincoln was arguing that the constitutional requirement of congressional authorization for war meant something. The argument was legally serious and politically dangerous, and Lincoln understood both of these things when he made it. The political cost came from Illinois. The state's Democratic newspapers hammered him as Spotty Lincoln, a man who had stabbed his country in the back. The district's voters were not receptive to constitutional arguments about the war's origins when the war itself was producing victories. Lincoln had calculated that the constitutional principle was worth the political cost. He had perhaps not calculated the cost precisely enough. He worked hard during his single term on less visible matters. He attended committee meetings on the post office and advocated for constituent interests with the department agencies. He helped with the Whig campaign for Zachary Taylor's presidential nomination in 1848 with an energy that he hoped would produce a patronage appointment. Taylor won the presidency. Lincoln applied for the position of Commissioner of the General Land Office. The appointment went to someone else. He returned to Springfield in the autumn of 1849, having accomplished less than he had hoped. The congressional term had given him 2 years of close observation of the national government, but its immediate yield was a return to private law practice with a complicated reputation. Mary Todd's response to the Washington experience was its own kind of data. She had found the city difficult and the boarding house life unsuitable for small children. Her intelligence and her ambition had nowhere useful to go, and the frustration of this would become a recurring condition of her life. Lincoln rode back into the Eighth Circuit in 1849 with the particular focus of a man who had tried a larger stage and been returned to a smaller one. He understood that the smaller one was, for the present, where the work was. Chapter 8: The Decade of Return. The Eighth Judicial Circuit in the early 1850s covered 14 counties across the center of Illinois. It was a roughly rectangular territory of prairie and river bottom that required its traveling lawyers to ride something like 400 miles in the spring term. Judge David Davis's court made its twice-yearly circuit through the district. Accommodations were what the county seats provided, sometimes a decent tavern room, sometimes a farmhouse floor. Lincoln rode this circuit more completely than almost any other lawyer practicing on it. He was away from Springfield for months at a stretch, twice a year, through most of the 1850s. The reasons for this thoroughness were partly financial and partly temperamental. Financially, the circuit work was the practice's engine. Temperamentally, Lincoln was at ease on the circuit in a way that the domestic life of his household did not always permit. Mary Todd's own frustrated energy sometimes expressed itself as sharp criticism. This is not a complaint. It is a description of a marriage between two people of strong and incompatible temperaments. Lincoln rode away into the circuit, and she managed the household. Each of them did what their situation required without the arrangement being anyone's preferred outcome. The law practice was growing into something substantial. Lincoln's reputation for plain argument and honest dealing had made him one of the most sought-after attorneys in central Illinois. He handled the full range of cases: land title disputes, debt collections, contract arguments, and criminal defenses. He represented railroads and he represented farmers suing railroads. The consistent principle was competent representation of whoever had retained you rather than loyalty to any class of client. The Illinois Central Railroad case arrived in 1854 and became the largest single fee of his legal career. The railroad had been challenging McLean County's authority to tax its property. Lincoln was retained and he won. The railroad then asked him to argue the same question from the railroad's side in a subsequent case. When he submitted his fee for the combined work, $5,000, the railroad declined to pay. Lincoln sued the Illinois Central Railroad for his fee and won. The $5,000 represented more than 3 times his average annual income. The episode illustrated a willingness to insist on his own valuation without apology. Edward Baker Lincoln died on February 1, 1850, 3 years old. He had been ill for much of the preceding year. Lincoln and Mary Todd had watched the illness progress with total helplessness. The death registered in Lincoln in ways the record shows obliquely, a deepening of the gravity present since Anne Rutledge's death. He did not discuss Eddie's death extensively in surviving correspondence. He continued working the circuit that spring because there was nothing else to do with grief except work. The deaths of Henry Clay and Daniel Webster in 1852 marked the end of something in the political world. Clay died in June, Webster in October. Their departures left the Whig Party without the two figures who had defined its ideological center. Lincoln had venerated Clay specifically, had described him as his political ideal. Clay's death was both a personal loss and a signaling of the collapse of the Whig framework. The party had already been fracturing over slavery for years. Without Clay and Webster, there was no figure capable of performing the centrist holding operation. The party began coming apart at a pace that made its eventual dissolution visible. Lincoln paid attention. He was not yet certain what would replace the Whig Party, but he continued practicing law and watching the landscape with patience. He understood that the conditions for action were not yet present. Stephen Douglas changed the conditions in 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was a 37-page bill to organize the territories for settlement and eventual statehood. Its operative provision was popular sovereignty, the principle that the settlers would decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. This provision necessarily repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It had stood for 34 years as the foundational agreement by which the country managed expansion. Douglas argued that popular sovereignty was a more democratic approach. His critics argued that he was dismantling the only reliable barrier to slavery's unlimited expansion. The political earthquake the bill produced was immediate and severe. Anti-Nebraska coalitions began forming across the North, drawing together former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, and Free Soilers. Lincoln read the coverage with the attention he had been giving to national developments since his days in New Salem. His response was not immediate. He watched through the summer of 1854 as the landscape reorganized itself. What he was doing was constructing the most comprehensive anti-slavery constitutional argument he had yet assembled. The Kansas-Nebraska Act did not create the argument. It created the occasion for delivering it. The occasion was Peoria, on October 16, 1854. The Peoria speech was in some respects the most complete statement of the moral case against the expansion of slavery. He began with history, the Missouri Compromise, and the understanding of its permanence. He moved through the constitutional framework and the founding generation's attitude toward slavery as a necessary evil. He arrived at the moral argument that a system founded on equality could not indefinitely expand a system built on its opposite. The argument was careful to distinguish between the legal status of slavery where it existed and its expansion into new territory. Holding that ground precisely was the work of the Peoria speech and of everything Lincoln would argue for the next 11 years. Douglas left the hall before Lincoln finished. The speech produced a series of invitations to deliver versions of it across Illinois and eventually beyond. The Whig Party did not survive the Kansas-Nebraska Act. By the end of 1854, it had effectively ceased to exist as a national organization. Lincoln was not yet certain what his relationship to this new party would be. He was certain, riding back to Springfield from Peoria, that the question he had been thinking about for 20 years had arrived at the center. It was not going to leave. Chapter 9: Douglas and the Reawakening. The new party took shape slowly, by the standards of later political organization, and quickly by the standards of its own moment. Across the North through 1854 and 1855, anti-Nebraska coalitions were holding conventions and publishing platforms and arguing about names, some calling themselves Republicans, some anti-Nebraska, some fusion, and the arguments about names were also arguments about identity, about whether the new organization would be a single-issue anti-slavery vehicle or a broader coalition, one that could absorb the remnants of the Whig program, the nativist Know-Nothing movement, and the anti-slavery Democrats who had broken with their party over Kansas-Nebraska. Lincoln watched this process with the attention he gave to all coalition questions, which was close and patient. He navigated it with a care that reflected his understanding of positioning. The wrong move in the early months of a new party's formation could close doors that would take years to reopen. He was not, in 1854 and early 1855, calling himself a Republican. He described himself as anti-Nebraska and let the label rest there. He held himself at enough distance from the more radical abolitionists within the new coalition. This ensured that conservative former Whigs and anti-Nebraska Democrats did not feel that joining the coalition meant joining an abolitionist organization. This was not deception. Lincoln was genuinely not an abolitionist in the sense that Owen Lovejoy was an abolitionist. He did not believe the Constitution gave the federal government authority to abolish slavery in the states where it existed. What he believed, and what he also said consistently, was that slavery was wrong, that its expansion must be stopped, and that a republic founded on the claim that all men are created equal could not survive indefinitely. It could not remain half slave and half free without the contradiction resolving itself in one direction or the other. Owen Lovejoy carried a particular weight in this coalition that was not purely political. His brother Elijah Lovejoy had been a Presbyterian minister and newspaper editor in Alton, Illinois. He had published anti-slavery material in his paper through the mid-1830s and received escalating threats in response. He was shot and killed by a pro-slavery mob in November 1837 while defending his printing press. Elijah Lovejoy's death had made him the abolitionist movement's first martyr. Owen Lovejoy had organized his own public life around the conviction that his brother's death placed a specific obligation on him. He was a congressman from Illinois, a genuine abolitionist, and a man whose presence immediately identified that coalition as morally serious. Moderate voters often felt uncomfortable with that seriousness. Lincoln's relationship with Owen Lovejoy was one of the more carefully managed of his political life. He respected Lovejoy, found his moral conviction genuine rather than performed. He understood that the anti slavery energy Lovejoy represented was essential to the Republican coalition, but he also knew it was capable of destroying the coalition if it became its only defining face. He kept Lovejoy close enough to honor the alliance, and at enough distance to preserve the coalition's appeal to the voters Lovejoy could not reach. The Senate race of 1855 was the first test of whether Lincoln could translate his renewed political standing into an actual victory. The Illinois General Assembly would choose the state's United States Senator in February 1855. Lincoln entered the contest as the leading anti Nebraska candidate. His vote total briefly reached 45 of the 100 members. The problem was arithmetic of a specific and painful kind. The remaining anti Nebraska votes were held by 5 members who were anti Nebraska Democrats. They were willing to vote against a pro Nebraska Democrat, but were not willing to vote for a Whig. They had coalesced around Lyman Trumbull as their preferred candidate. The balloting went through 46 rounds over 2 days. Lincoln's total held at 45 for several rounds, then began to slip. The pro-Nebraska Democrats consolidated behind a candidate who threatened to win if the opposition remained divided. The mathematics became clear. Lincoln could not reach the majority he needed. Continuing to hold his supporters on his own name was going to produce the worst possible outcome. A pro-Nebraska senator chosen because the anti-Nebraska majority had failed to unite. He released his delegates to Trumbull. The decision was made in a specific conversation with his floor managers. The moment when Lincoln told them to move his supporters to Trumbull, and the supporters moved. Trumbull won on the next ballot. Mary Todd Lincoln was reportedly furious. Trumbull's wife Julia was a friend of hers. The social complexity of watching her husband hand his Senate victory to a rival was not trivial. Lincoln himself described the outcome with a flatness that suggested the decision had cost him more than he was prepared to discuss. What he did not do was argue that he had been wrong to make it. The tactical logic was sound, and he knew it. Trumbull's election kept the Senate seat out of pro-Nebraska hands. It established a working relationship between Lincoln and the anti-Nebraska Democrats. Sacrificing his own immediate advancement for the coalition's long-term strength was a calculation that the legislature had taught him. He made the calculation. The coalition remembered. The formal organization of the Illinois Republican Party took place at the Bloomington Convention in May 1856. Lincoln's speech there was delivered to a hall of delegates from every county in the state. It represented the full range of anti-slavery opinion from the cautious to the radical. The speech was electrifying enough that the reporters present later said they had stopped taking notes. They were too absorbed in listening. The speech was never transcribed and the text has not survived. This is why it is known as the lost speech. What the delegates and reporters described afterward was consistent. Lincoln had laid out the case for the new party with an emotional force and a constitutional precision. He had held the coalition's internal tensions in suspension by appealing to the shared ground beneath the disagreements. He had left the room feeling that the new party was both necessary and possible. Frederick Douglass was not present at Bloomington. but his presence in the political world was a fact of the landscape. As the most prominent Black American voice in national public life, his analysis of slavery was more penetrating than almost anyone else's. Lincoln and Douglas had not yet met. Their political universes were separated by the specific gap that the Republican Party strategy required Lincoln to maintain. A party that could win Illinois had to hold voters who accepted the wrongness of slavery's expansion. But many were not prepared to accept the political and social equality of Black Americans. Lincoln's public statements reflected this constraint. Douglas understood this constraint and found it frustrating. He would revise his assessment of Lincoln over the following decade as events provided new evidence. The 1856 presidential race produced John C. Fremont as the Republican nominee. Lincoln campaigned for him across Illinois with the energy of a man who understood the stakes. Fremont lost the general election to James Buchanan, but the Republican performance demonstrated that the coalition was real. The party had carried 11 northern states and come within a few electoral votes of the presidency. Lincoln had made over 50 speeches for Fremont across Illinois. The network of organizers and editors who had watched him do it constituted a powerful infrastructure. Douglas returned to Illinois in 1858 for his own Senate re-election campaign in a position of complexity. The Lecompton Constitution, a pro-slavery document for Kansas, had split the Democratic Party. Douglas opposed it on the grounds that it had not been legitimately ratified by Kansas's actual settlers. His opposition had made him a hero to Northern Democrats and a villain to Southern ones. Some Eastern Republicans were suggesting that Douglas deserved support as a reward for his anti-Lecompton stand. Lincoln found this suggestion, to put it mildly, unpersuasive. Douglas was not an anti-slavery man. He was a popular sovereignty man. His opposition to Lecompton was procedural rather than moral. He objected to the fraud, not to the slavery. Rewarding him would have dismantled the Illinois Republican Party's reason for existing. The Illinois Republican Convention met in Springfield on June 16, 1858. It took the unusual step of declaring Lincoln the party's candidate for the Senate seat before the campaign had begun. Lincoln addressed the convention that evening with the speech that gave the campaign its defining image. A house divided against itself cannot stand. He had been working the formulation for years, testing it in private conversations. He knew when he delivered it that it would be controversial. He knew Douglas would use it to paint him as a radical who favored sectional conflict. He used it anyway because he believed it was true. He was no longer willing to omit what he believed to be true in order to manage the reception. Douglas accepted Lincoln's challenge to a series of direct debates across the state. The summer of 1858 opened onto something Illinois had not quite seen before. Two of the state's most capable political minds arguing the central question of American public life directly. The whole country was eventually watching. Chapter 10: The Lincoln-Douglas Debates. The physical reality of the 1858 campaign was considerable before a single debate had been held. The 7 sites were distributed across Illinois from north to south and east to west. Ottawa in the north, Jonesboro in the south, Galesburg on the western prairie, and Alton on the Mississippi. The distances between them were significant in an era of rail travel. Lincoln and Douglas spent much of the autumn on trains and in hotel rooms. They moved in open carriages through whatever weather the Illinois autumn provided. Lincoln traveled with a small group of advisors and supporters. Douglas traveled with a larger retinue and a private car equipped with a small cannon. It fired salutes at each station the train passed through. Lincoln observed this with the dry appreciation of a man who understood the performance. The crowds were the most immediate fact of the debates themselves. Ottawa drew approximately 10,000 people, which was roughly twice the town's population. Galesburg drew 12,000, the largest of the seven. Jonesboro drew 1,500, the smallest crowd, and the one least hospitable to Lincoln's arguments. Quincy drew 10,000. Alton, the final debate, drew 5 or 6,000 to a river city. It was a city that sat directly across the Mississippi from Missouri. The geography of the slavery question was a constant presence there. The format was consistent across all seven. One candidate spoke for an hour, the other responded for 90 minutes, and the first had 30 minutes to close. The speaking order rotated. In Ottawa, Douglas opened. In Freeport, Lincoln opened. Each debate ran between 2 and 3 hours, in the open air, without amplification. The speakers projected to crowds whose outer edges could hear only imperfectly. Nonetheless, they stayed for the duration. The spectacle of two men arguing the most urgent question in public life was worth the effort. Ottawa was difficult for Lincoln. Douglas had prepared his opening carefully, framing Lincoln as a radical abolitionist. He claimed the House divided speech revealed an intention to make war on the South. Douglas read from Lincoln's earlier speeches with selective precision. He assembled a portrait of an extreme man whose positions shifted depending on the audience. The charges were partly fair and partly not. Douglas delivered them with the force of a veteran of the large stage. Lincoln's response did not land with the crispness the moment needed. He left Ottawa having answered the charges without quite dispelling them. Freeport changed the dynamic, and it changed it through a question. Lincoln had been thinking about a specific vulnerability in Douglas's position. The Dred Scott decision of 1857 had created a direct collision with popular sovereignty. The Supreme Court had ruled that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. If Congress could not prohibit slavery, how could a territorial legislature do so? Popular sovereignty appeared to have been constitutionally foreclosed. Lincoln stood at Freeport on August 27 and asked Douglas to resolve this contradiction. Could the people of a territory exclude slavery before forming a state constitution? Douglas had an answer, known as the Freeport Doctrine. He argued that regardless of the Supreme Court, slavery could not exist without local legislation to protect it. A hostile population could simply decline to pass such legislation. This rendered the Dred Scott decision meaningless in practice. Popular sovereignty survived because slavery needed local protection to function. This answer was good enough to hold the Illinois Democratic Coalition together in 1858, but it was not good enough to survive the scrutiny of Southern Democrats. They understood that Douglas had publicly undermined the Dred Scott decision, a candidate who suggested nullifying a Supreme Court ruling was not one they could support in 1860. Lincoln had asked one question, and the answer would help fracture the Democratic Party 2 years later. Whether Lincoln foresaw this consequence precisely is a question the record does not resolve. He said later that he knew the Freeport question would probably cost him the Senate race. He believed it would help the larger cause in the long run. The documents show a man who understood the logic thoroughly. He had worked through the collision carefully enough to know that Douglas had no clean answer. He asked it anyway, in the largest public forum available. The remaining 5 debates elaborated the collision without changing its terms. At Charleston, Lincoln addressed the racial equality question directly. He said he was not in favor of social and political equality between the races. He said he did not favor black suffrage or jury service or intermarriage. These statements reflected the specific limitations of what a winning Republican coalition could sustain. They were also his honest assessment of the politically achievable. At Galesburg and Quincy, the debate moved back to constitutional ground. Lincoln focused on the founding generation's treatment of slavery as a temporary evil. Douglas reached for the argument that the Declaration's language did not apply to Black Americans. Lincoln's response was among his clearest formulations. He argued that a principle applied only to those in power was no principle at all. Alton was the last debate. On October 15, Lincoln closed the series by arguing that the real issue was whether slavery was wrong. Douglas, he argued, professed indifference. Lincoln argued that this indifference was itself a moral position, and the wrong one. A nation founded on equality could not sustain permanent indifference to human bondage. The legislative vote in November returned 54 Douglas Democrats and 46 Republicans. Douglas was re-elected as senator by the margin the legislature produced. Lincoln had won the popular vote, but the districts had been drawn in ways that translated this majority into a legislative minority. Lincoln wrote to a friend that the fight must go on. The debates had produced something neither man intended, a national text. The transcripts had been published and reprinted across the country. Lincoln had become one of the most recognizable Republican voices in the country. He was known for the sustained argument of an entire campaign. Invitations to speak outside Illinois began arriving through the winter of 1858. Lincoln accepted them carefully, traveling to Ohio, Kansas, and Wisconsin. The National Party was watching. Douglas had won the Senate seat. Lincoln had won a national reputation built on the record of what he actually believed. Chapter 11: The Road to Chicago. The speaking invitations that had begun arriving after the debates led Lincoln, in February 1860, to New York City. The New York appearance clarified something about his national standing that the Illinois reputation had not quite resolved. The invitation had come from a Young Men's Republican Union that had originally arranged to hear Reverend Henry Ward Beecher. They had redirected the engagement to Lincoln when Beecher became unavailable, a substitution that suggested Lincoln was understood to be a reasonable replacement for one of the most famous ministers in America. It was a measure of how far the circuit lawyer from Springfield had traveled in the 18 months since Freeport. The venue was Cooper Union, a lecture hall on Astor Place that seated approximately 1,500 people. It served as one of New York's premier platforms for serious public argument. Lincoln arrived in the city on February 25, 1860, having traveled from Springfield by rail through Ohio and Pennsylvania. It was a journey of roughly 30 hours, during which his best suit had acquired the wrinkles that rail travel reliably produced in wool fabric. No amount of attention at his hotel could entirely eliminate them. He was photographed by Matthew Brady the afternoon before the speech. The photograph that resulted, Lincoln standing in formal posture, his collar straightened, his expression carrying the specific seriousness of a man who understood the occasion, became one of the most widely reproduced images of his face. The suit was still not quite right. Brady reportedly adjusted Lincoln's collar before the exposure. The audience that gathered on the evening of February 27 had come with a set of expectations shaped by the newspaper coverage of the debates. They expected a frontier politician of unusual ability, but they also brought the natural skepticism of a sophisticated Eastern city. To them, his principal qualification appeared to be that he had almost beaten Stephen Douglas in an Illinois Senate race. What they encountered was something different from what the reputation had prepared them for. Not the rough-hewn prairie lawyer of the Eastern imagination, but a constitutional scholar who had spent the preceding weeks in research. The research was so thorough that the Cooper Union Address carried footnotes in its published form, a scholarly apparatus that most political speeches of the era did not require. The speech's central argument was historical. Lincoln had compiled a systematic survey of the 39 men who had signed the Constitution. He examined their subsequent actions on the question of congressional authority over slavery in the territories. Of the 39, he found that 21 had taken positions on the question in their post-constitutional careers. He found that 16 of those 21 had voted or acted in ways consistent with the position that Congress did possess such authority. The argument was not merely rhetorical, it was documented, case by case, vote by vote. A lawyer's brief assembled from the historical record and delivered to an audience that could follow the logic. Lincoln was not asking the New York audience to take his word for the founding generation's understanding. He was showing them the evidence and walking them through the reasoning. The hall's reception shifted as the speech progressed. The audience that had come with mild interest found itself engaged, then absorbed, then responding with the specific energy of discovery. They were hearing an argument they had not previously encountered in quite that form. The applause came at the constitutional passages and grew through the speech's second half. Lincoln turned from the historical argument to the political one, addressing Southern threats to dissolve the Union if a Republican president were elected. He addressed the Republican coalition's internal tensions between the radical and moderate wings. He arrived finally at the speech's closing injunction. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. The New York Tribune published the full text the following morning. Within days, it had been reprinted across the North. Lincoln spent the next 2 weeks in New England, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire. These were the states where his sons were being educated and where the Republican organizations were eager to present the debate champion. He delivered versions of the Cooper Union argument to halls that filled beyond their intended capacity. He responded to the specific energy of audiences who had read the Tribune's transcript and wanted to see the man behind it. He returned to Springfield in mid-March and resumed the practice of law with the circuit's spring term. He carried the Cooper Union reception as private information about his own standing rather than a public campaign. The Republican presidential nomination was 8 weeks away. He had not announced a candidacy. He was not certain, in the way that candidates in that era were rarely certain, whether the nomination was achievable or even fully desirable. He wondered whether the moment was his and whether he was ready for what the moment would require. The other candidates were more visible and better known. William Henry Seward of New York was the presumed frontrunner, a senator of national reputation, explicitly anti-slavery since the 1840s. He was supported by Thurlow Weed's formidable New York political machine, carrying the accumulated prestige of a long career. Salmon Chase of Ohio had similar credentials and similar ambitions. He brought the additional complexity of a personality that many of his colleagues found difficult to work with over extended periods. It was a fact that his supporters consistently underestimated as a liability. Edward Bates of Missouri was the candidate of the conservative wing, a former Whig of advanced age and moderate anti-slavery views. He was attractive to those who believed the Republican Party needed to soften its profile to win the border states. Lincoln's path to the nomination ran through the convention's arithmetic rather than through accumulated prestige. The Republican Party needed to win the presidency, which meant it needed to carry the swing states of the lower north, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, states whose political cultures were more moderate on the slavery question. Seward's long record of explicit anti-slavery advocacy made him a potentially weaker general election candidate than his primary strength suggested. Lincoln had won the Cooper Union audience without alarming them. He had held the Illinois Republican coalition together across the full spectrum from conservative former Whigs to anti-slavery radicals. He was, in the language used in private conversations throughout the spring, the candidate who could win where Seward could not. David Davis had been the judge of the 8th Judicial Circuit, Lincoln's circuit, for years. A large and capable man who understood both law and politics with equal fluency. He had developed a genuine conviction that Lincoln was the most able figure in the national party. He organized Lincoln's convention operation with the thoroughness of someone who understood that nominations were won by groundwork. Norman Judd, the Illinois Republican chairman, worked the procedural angles, the convention's rules, the seating arrangements, the scheduling of the balloting. The Republican National Convention opened in Chicago on May 16, 1860, in the Wigwam, a purpose-built wooden hall on the lakefront, constructed in 6 weeks, seating 10,000 people with standing room for additional thousands. It smelled of fresh lumber and the specific excitement of an organization that believed it was about to win. Lincoln remained in Springfield, receiving telegraph dispatches as the proceedings developed. He was doing what waiting required of a man who had spent his entire political life learning to be patient with results. The first ballot gave Seward 1,730 fuffs, Lincoln 102, Chase 49, and Bates 48. Seward's lead was substantial but not decisive. He needed 233 votes for the nomination and had not reached it. Davis and Judd had spent the preceding days making commitments to the Indiana and Pennsylvania delegations. These were commitments about cabinet positions and patronage that exceeded Lincoln's explicit authorization. Lincoln had told Davis he would make no promises. Davis had concluded that winning required making them anyway. Indiana moved to Lincoln on the second ballot. Pennsylvania followed. The second ballot gave Lincoln 181 votes and Seward 184 handfaf, a narrowing so dramatic that the third ballot's outcome was visible. Ohio shifted. Maryland shifted. The third ballot gave Lincoln 2,3,100 votes, 1.5 votes short of the nomination. Before the official count was complete, a delegate from Ohio rose to change 4 Ohio votes, carrying Lincoln past the threshold. The wigwam erupted with a noise that was audible across the city. Lincoln received the news in Springfield at the telegraph office. He walked home through streets that were beginning to fill with celebration. He told the men who gathered at his house that there was a little woman on 8th Street who would want to hear the news. He went inside. Mary Todd Lincoln had been waiting, as she had waited through the legislative campaigns and the congressional term. She stood at the intersection of her own ambitions and her husband's, which had always been pointed at the same destination. They had always arrived there on a schedule she could not control. Chapter 12: The Team of Rivals. The men Lincoln chose for his cabinet had spent the better part of 1860 trying to prevent him from becoming president. He chose them anyway. This was not magnanimity in the sentimental sense, not a generous man extending forgiveness to his defeated opponents. It was a calculation made with the same arithmetic that had governed the Long Nine and the 1855 Senate sacrifice. He believed the best Republican talent in the country needed to be inside the administration rather than available to compete with it. The factional and geographic representation each man carried was essential to holding together a coalition. It was a coalition that had never yet governed anything and was about to govern everything. Seward was the first and most important appointment. Lincoln offered him the State Department in the days immediately following the election. Seward's initial response was something between reluctance and refusal, a hesitation that reflected genuine uncertainty. He wondered whether he could serve under a man he had considered his inferior. It reflected also the specific wound of having been the presumptive nominee and then not been. He consulted Thurlow Weed, who told him that refusing would be a mistake of the kind that ended careers. Seward accepted in mid December, and the relationship that followed would become one of the administration's defining features. Salmon Chase at the Treasury was a more complicated calculation. Chase was brilliant, systematically ambitious in the way that made colleagues uncomfortable because the ambition was never concealed. He possessed a conviction that he was the most capable man in any room he entered. Lincoln knew all of this and appointed him anyway, because Chase's anti-slavery credentials were essential. A Chase excluded from the cabinet was a Chase organizing opposition to it. Edward Bates at the Attorney General satisfied the conservative former Whigs and the border state Republicans. Simon Cameron at the War Department was a Pennsylvania political boss whose appointment was a consequence of convention commitments. It was a debt the administration paid and quickly regretted, as Cameron's management proved to be inadequate. Montgomery Blair at the post office brought the border state connection that Maryland and Missouri required. Gideon Wells at the Navy was a Connecticut Yankee of dry competence whose diary would become a vital record. Caleb Smith at the Interior was another convention debt. The cabinet as assembled was a collection of strong personalities, competing ambitions, and divergent political histories. Lincoln would need to manage them while managing a national crisis. It was a challenge that Lincoln met by understanding something about the members that they did not initially understand about him. The secession winter ran from December 1860 through March 1861. It was as bleak a period as any president-elect had faced before taking office. South Carolina seceded on December 20, 6 weeks after the election. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed in January and February. The Confederate States of America was organized at Montgomery, Alabama, with Jefferson Davis as its president. The Buchanan administration, in its final months, did nothing effective to halt the process. Buchanan believed secession was unconstitutional, but that the federal government had no authority to prevent it. It was a legal construction that satisfied no one and protected nothing. Lincoln watched from Springfield, receiving a continuous stream of visitors and office seekers and journalists. He said as little as possible in public about his intentions. He understood that any statement he made before taking office would be used by someone to make the situation worse. He was not passive. He was in constant communication with Republican leaders about compromise proposals. Most of these involved some form of concession on the territorial slavery question that Lincoln was unwilling to make. The Crittenden Compromise was the most serious of these proposals. Lincoln opposed it with the same argument he had been making since Peoria, that the point of the party was to prevent slavery's expansion. He traveled to Washington by train in February, the journey broken into segments for security reasons. There were credible reports of assassination plots in Baltimore, and the route through the city was altered at the last moment. Lincoln made brief appearances in the cities along the way with careful restraint. He had decided to say nothing that could be used against him until he was actually president and could act. The inaugural platform was constructed on the east front of the Capitol, still under construction. The dome's iron framework was rising, the crane that would place the Statue of Freedom visible above the scaffolding. Lincoln delivered his first inaugural address on March 4, 1861. He spoke to a crowd that included many men who expected war and some who hoped for it. He spoke in the shadow of a building that was unfinished and that he was asking the country to help him complete. The address was measured and precise, aimed simultaneously at the southern states still in the Union. He told the South that he had no intention and no constitutional authority to interfere with slavery where it existed. He told them that the Union was constitutionally perpetual, that no state could leave it by its own act. Whether the country had peace or war was not his choice to make, it was theirs. The closing paragraph had been revised with Seward's help, softened from Lincoln's original draft. It carried the specific cadence of a man reaching across an unbridgeable distance with language that acknowledged the gap. Fort Sumter had been the immediate crisis since the secession of South Carolina. The federal garrison under Major Robert Anderson was running short of supplies. Lincoln faced the choice of resupplying it, which would be treated as an act of war, or evacuating it. Seward advised evacuating Sumter, believing the crisis could be managed through diplomacy. Lincoln decided to resupply it. He notified the governor of South Carolina of his intention to send unarmed supply ships. The Confederate government ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard to demand Sumter's surrender. Anderson refused. Confederate batteries opened fire at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861. The bombardment continued for 34 hours until Anderson surrendered. No Union soldiers died in the bombardment itself. The fort was gone. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers the following day. The responses to the call revealed the geography of what was coming. The northern states sent men with an enthusiasm that overwhelmed the War Department. Virginia seceded on April 17th, followed by Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. The border states remained in the Union, some of them barely. Their retention would require the specific political management Lincoln had been practicing for 30 years. The cabinet met for the first time as a war cabinet in the week after Sumter's fall. The men around the table were beginning to understand something about the man at the head. He listened more than he spoke. He asked questions whose purpose was not always immediately apparent. He made decisions without announcing them as decisions. He was not what they had expected, a frontier politician in over his head. He was something they were still in the process of identifying. The identification would take time that events were not inclined to provide. Chapter 13: The First Year of the War. What the first year of the war was not: a swift federal suppression of a rebellion that most of official Washington had expected to dissolve within weeks under the pressure of Union military superiority. The expectation had been reasonable by the arithmetic of 1861. The North had 22 million people to the South's 9 million, of whom 3.5 million were enslaved. It had the factories, The railroads, the navy, the financial system, and the established government. The Confederacy had conviction, geography, and a military tradition that had supplied a disproportionate share of the United States Army's officer corps before secession pulled those officers south. These advantages were not visible in the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had encouraged a confidence in quick resolution that the summer of 1861 corrected with a thoroughness that left no room for the original expectation to survive. Irvin McDowell commanded the army that marched out of Washington toward Manassas, Virginia on July 16, 1861. With approximately 35,000 men and the knowledge that their 90-day enlistments were expiring. The political pressure to act before those enlistments ran out was considerable. Lincoln had urged caution. The cabinet and the Congress and the northern newspapers had urged movement. McDowell moved. The Confederate forces under P.G.T. Beauregard held a defensive position along Bull Run Creek, and the battle that developed on July 21 went through several reversals before the Union advance broke in the mid-afternoon. In the space of an hour, it became a retreat, and then something closer to a rout. The road back to Washington filled with Union soldiers mixed with the civilian spectators who had driven out from the city in carriages to watch the expected victory. The mixture of armed men and frightened civilians and abandoned equipment moved through the hot July afternoon toward the Capitol in a disorder that was visible from the city's rooftops. Lincoln received the battle reports through the afternoon and evening with the specific steadiness that extreme bad news produced in him. It was a quieting rather than a panic, a movement toward the practical question of what needed to be done next rather than the emotional question of what had just happened. What needed to be done next was a commander capable of organizing the demoralized army into something that could be used. George Brinton McClellan arrived in Washington 5 days after Bull Run, with a reputation built on small but successful operations in Western Virginia and the immediate confidence of a man who understood organization. McClellan was 34 years old, a West Point graduate, a former Army officer who had left the service to work as a railroad executive and had returned at the war's outbreak. He was genuinely gifted at the work of building an army, at the logistics and the drilling and the organizational structure that transformed a collection of armed volunteers into a coherent military force. The Army of the Potomac that he assembled through the late summer and autumn of 1861 was, by the following spring, the largest and best equipped army the Western Hemisphere had yet seen. What McClellan could build, he could not easily use. His confidence in his own administrative abilities was matched by a caution in the field that expressed itself as a consistent overestimate of Confederate strength. He believed himself to be the indispensable man of the war, referred to himself in letters to his wife as the young Napoleon, and managed his relationship with Lincoln with a condescension that became increasingly open. Lincoln read McClellan's dispatches, absorbed his excuses, visited him at his headquarters, and waited with a patience that his cabinet found difficult to share. He was learning the war in these months, learning what an army required to move, what a commander needed to function, and how the military and political dimensions of the conflict interacted. The learning was not comfortable. It was conducted under the pressure of a Congress that had formed a joint committee on the conduct of the war in December 1861. John C. Fremont's tenure as commander of the Department of the West produced the first direct collision between Lincoln's political management and the anti slavery convictions of the Republican Party's radical wing. Fremont issued a proclamation in August 1861 declaring martial law in Missouri and freeing the enslaved people of anyone in the state who had taken up arms against the United States. The proclamation went beyond Lincoln's own position and threatened the administration's hold on the border states. Missouri itself, but also Kentucky and Maryland, whose Unionist majorities were provisional. Lincoln wrote to Fremont privately, asking him to modify the proclamation to conform to existing law. Fremont refused and sent his wife Jessie to Washington to argue his case directly to the president. Lincoln then ordered the modification publicly, which converted a private disagreement into a public rebuke, and eventually relieved Fremont of his command in November. The radical Republicans in Congress were outraged. Lincoln absorbed the outrage and held his position, not because he disagreed with the goals, but because he understood the trade the Union could not afford. Edward Dickinson Baker was 50 years old in October 1861 and had been Lincoln's closest friend in politics since the New Salem days. He commanded a brigade at Ball's Bluff, Virginia, in an engagement that was poorly planned and poorly executed. Baker was killed leading his men on the bluff, shot multiple times, dead before the engagement ended in the Union retreat that cost the brigade nearly half its men. Lincoln received the news at the War Department telegraph office. He walked out of the building without speaking, crossed the street, and stood on the pavement in the October afternoon for some time. He had known Baker for 25 years. He had given a son Baker's name. The loss registered in him at a depth that the war's larger casualty figures had not yet reached. The Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War convened in December 1861 with a mandate to investigate Ball's Bluff and the broader question of why the Army of the Potomac had not moved. The committee was dominated by radical Republicans who were suspicious of Democratic generals and increasingly convinced that the administration was fighting the war with insufficient commitment. Willie Lincoln had been ill since late November. He and his brother Tad had both contracted what was likely typhoid fever, carried in the water supply of a city whose sanitation was unequal to the war. Tad's illness was serious. Willie's was worse, and by January 1862, it was clear to the doctors attending him that the boy was not recovering. The army that had been built at enormous expense had not yet fought a major engagement since Bull Run. The border states were held, barely. The Confederate government in Richmond was as established as it had been in April. And in the White House on 8th Street, on a bed in a room that Lincoln visited in the evenings when the day's work permitted, his 11-year-old son was growing steadily weaker. Chapter 14: The Weight of 1862. Willie Lincoln died on February 20, 1862, in the White House bedroom where he had lain for 3 weeks while the typhoid worked through him. He was the child most like his father in temperament, thoughtful, fond of books, given to writing verse and organizing the neighborhood children into mock military formations. Lincoln's grief at his loss was of the kind that does not organize itself into language easily or quickly. The funeral was held in the East Room on February 24, the casket resting under the chandelier in the room where Lincoln had been receiving visitors for the past 10 months. Mary Todd Lincoln did not attend the funeral. She was confined to her room by a grief that had moved past the ordinary boundaries of mourning into something that alarmed the people around her. A collapse so complete that she could not dress herself, could not see visitors, could not perform the functions that a president's wife was expected to perform, even in the middle of a war. Her eldest son, Robert, was at Harvard. Her youngest, Tad, was simultaneously ill with the same fever and recovering in another room of the same house. Lincoln was managing his grief over one son while nursing his fear for another, in a building where his wife had ceased to function and where the telegraph continued to deliver war news. Lincoln visited the burial vault in Georgetown twice after Willie's interment, returning alone, asking the attendant to open the casket, and standing beside his son's face in the vault's cold air. What these visits suggest is a man doing what he had done since childhood with loss that had no remedy, returning to it directly, looking at it without flinching, and then continuing. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton observed Lincoln through this period with the attention of a man who was still forming his assessment of the president he served. What he saw in February and March of 1862 was a man carrying a private grief of considerable weight while managing a public crisis of unprecedented scale. The Peninsula Campaign was McClellan's plan, and Lincoln had approved it after months of urging McClellan toward some plan at all. The idea was to move the Army of the Potomac by water down the Chesapeake Bay and advance overland up the peninsula to Richmond. McClellan had assembled approximately 100,000 men, more artillery than any American army had previously fielded, and a supply organization of considerable sophistication. What he lacked was the willingness to use the force he had built at the speed and with the decisiveness that the plan required. The advance up the peninsula proceeded with a caution that the terrain and the opposition did not justify. McClellan consistently reported Confederate forces at 2 or 3 times their actual strength. He called repeatedly for reinforcements that Lincoln did not have, and he blamed the administration for his failures of movement with a directness that crossed into insubordination. Robert E. Lee assumed command of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia in June 1862, and his assumption of command changed the Peninsula Campaign's character entirely. The 7 days' battles were Lee's counteroffensive, launched against a Union army that was numerically superior and that McClellan had positioned in a way that allowed Lee to strike. McClellan retreated to the James River at Harrison's Landing, his advance on Richmond abandoned, and from there he dispatched a letter to Lincoln with political instructions. Lincoln visited McClellan at Harrison's Landing in early July, partly to assess the Army's condition and partly to assess McClellan himself. He reviewed the troops, spoke with officers, and returned to Washington with the information he needed. He did not immediately relieve McClellan, but the Peninsula visit ended whatever remaining hope Lincoln had carried that McClellan would prosecute the war to its conclusion. John Pope was brought east from the Western Theater to command a new army of Virginia, and the experiment ended badly and quickly. At the Second Battle of Bull Run on August 28, 30, Confederate forces under Lee and Stonewall Jackson outmaneuvered Pope's army and drove it back toward Washington. Washington was briefly in a state of near panic. Lincoln restored McClellan to unified command because McClellan was the one man the demoralized army trusted. Antietam arrived on September 17, 1862, when Lee's army crossed the Potomac into Maryland and McClellan brought the Army of the Potomac to meet him near Sharpsburg. The battle was the bloodiest single day in American military history. Approximately 22,000 casualties combined, the dead and wounded distributed across cornfields and sunken roads. Lee withdrew across the Potomac the following night. McClellan did not pursue him, despite Lincoln's increasingly direct requests in the days that followed. The victory that might have been decisive became instead a victory that was real but incomplete. Lincoln had been waiting for exactly this, not for a perfect victory, but for a Union military success sufficient to provide the political ground he needed. He had drafted the Emancipation Proclamation in July and accepted the argument that issuing it after a string of Union defeats would look like a desperate measure. Within 5 days of the battle, Lincoln called the cabinet together and told them he had made a promise to himself and to his Maker that he would issue the proclamation. On September 23, 1862, the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was released to the public, giving the Confederate States 100 days to return to the Union. None of them returned. The 100 days ran out in the first hours of the new year, and January 1, 1863, arrived with Lincoln's hand trembling from hours of handshaking. He took the pen and paused. He told Seward and Chase that he did not want his hands trembling to make it appear that he had signed with hesitation. He steadied himself deliberately. He signed with the slow care of a man who understood that the signature was permanent. The pen moved across the paper, and the thing was done. Chapter 15: The Proclamation and Its Consequences. What the Emancipation Proclamation was, in the precise legal sense, mattered as much as what it was not. Both dimensions require examination to understand what Lincoln had actually done on the morning of January 1, 1863. The document was a war measure, issued under Lincoln's authority as Commander-in-Chief, rather than under any congressional statute or constitutional amendment. This meant its legal permanence was, at the moment of signing, genuinely uncertain. It was dependent on Union military victory and on courts that had not yet ruled on the scope of presidential war powers. It applied only to the Confederate States, exempting the border states still in the Union and the portions of Confederate territory already under Union control. This geographic limitation meant the proclamation did not immediately free a single person who was not already within reach of Union lines. It named approximately 3,100,000 enslaved people as free, and it could enforce that freedom only where Union armies could go. These limitations were real, and the proclamation's critics, then and later, used them to argue that it had freed no one, that it was a paper gesture without practical effect. This argument misunderstood the document's mechanics. The proclamation changed the war's legal character in a way that could not be undone by the people who wanted to undo it. Union victory now necessarily meant emancipation, because the proclamation was a presidential order that could not be withdrawn without acknowledging that the war had been lost. Every mile of Confederate territory that Union armies subsequently entered became free territory by operation of the proclamation. The Confederate States had no path back to the Union that did not carry emancipation with it. The limitation was not a loophole, it was the mechanism. Frederick Douglass had spent 20 years arguing that the Constitution provided tools for attacking slavery that the anti slavery movement had been too timid to use. His response to the proclamation was not unqualified. He understood its limitations as clearly as anyone, but it was genuine. He wrote that the 1st of January, 1863, was the most important day in the history of the American Republic since the 4th of July, 1776. It had converted a war for the Union into a war against slavery, and that conversion could not be reversed regardless of how the legal arguments eventually resolved. What Lincoln had done, Douglas understood, was change the war's meaning. Meaning, once changed at that scale, had consequences that legal precision could not contain. The enrollment of black soldiers followed from the proclamation's logic almost immediately. The War Department authorized the recruitment of United States colored troops in the months after the proclamation's issuance. The response was substantial. Men who had been legally prohibited from serving, who had watched the war proceed for nearly 2 years as a conflict ostensibly about union rather than slavery. By the war's end, approximately 180,000 black soldiers had served in the United States colored troops. They were organized into regiments that fought in every theater of the war from Louisiana to Virginia. Their service was not equal. They were initially paid less than white soldiers, assigned disproportionately to labor details, and commanded almost exclusively by white officers. But it was real, and it changed the war's composition in ways that the Confederate government found alarming. Harriet Beecher Stowe visited Lincoln at the White House in December 1862, in the weeks before the final proclamation. The meeting was brief, and the accounts vary enough that the famous line, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war," may or may not represent what was actually spoken. Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, had done more than any other single document to make Northern audiences feel the human reality of slavery. Lincoln understood the difference between knowing and feeling in this context because he had been working with it since the New Orleans levee in 1828. The political cost of the proclamation was immediate and measurable. The 1862 midterm elections produced significant Democratic gains in the House. The Democrats picked up 32 seats, with substantial losses in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and New York. The elections reflected a Northern electorate that had absorbed 2 years of military disappointment. They were now absorbing the information that the war's purpose had expanded. A portion of that electorate was not prepared to absorb the expansion. Lincoln read the results with specific attention and absorbed the losses without revising the policy. The armies that the proclamation energized were not, through the winter and spring of 1863, producing the military results that would give the policy justification. Ambrose Burnside had replaced McClellan in November 1862 and had led the army to Fredericksburg in December. He ordered a series of frontal assaults against Confederate forces entrenched on high ground behind the city. The assaults were methodical and devastating. Union forces crossed the Rappahannock River, advanced across an open plain, and were shot in successive waves from the heights of Marye's Hill. Confederate positions were so strong that the attackers could not approach them and could not stop being ordered to try. Approximately 12,600 Union casualties resulted from a battle that achieved nothing. Lincoln described the experience as feeling as if he could not recover from what he had seen. Joseph Hooker replaced Burnside in January 1863, and Hooker's Chancellorsville campaign in May produced a different kind of failure. It was tactically sophisticated in its planning, yet dismantled by Stonewall Jackson's flank attack and by Hooker's loss of confidence at the critical moment. Chancellorsville cost the Union approximately 17,000 casualties and cost the Confederacy Stonewall Jackson. He was accidentally shot by his own pickets and died of pneumonia a week later. Lee's greatest lieutenant was gone. Lee's army was still intact and moving north. The summer of 1863 resolved the military situation in two theaters simultaneously, and the resolution came on the same day. At Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, from July 1 through July 3, the Army of the Potomac under George Meade met Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's assault on the Union center on the third day ended in a repulse so complete that Lee never again had the strength for a major offensive. At Vicksburg, Mississippi, on the same July 4, Ulysses Grant accepted the surrender of the Confederate garrison after a siege of 47 days. This opened the entire length of the Mississippi River to Union control and cut the Confederacy in two. Lincoln had found in Grant the commander he had been looking for. The dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg came on November 19, 1863. Lincoln traveled to the Pennsylvania town with a speech in his coat pocket that he had been working on for weeks. The ceremony's principal address was delivered by Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours to an estimated crowd of 15,000 people. Lincoln followed with 2 minutes of speech. Everett wrote to Lincoln the following day to say that Lincoln had come closer to the central idea of the occasion in 2 minutes than he had in 2 hours. What Lincoln had done was take the consecration of a military cemetery and use it to redefine the war's meaning. He argued that the nation had been founded on the proposition of human equality. The proper honor for the dead was the dedication of the living to the unfinished work those dead had advanced. The speech was 87 words into the Gettysburg Address before Lincoln used the word nation. The Constitution uses the word nation not once. He was rewriting the founding document's emphasis, quietly and permanently, while a crowd of 15,000 listened. The year that had begun with a trembling hand over a signature ended with a 2-minute speech that would be memorized by school children for the next century and a half. The language had achieved the compression that genuine argument reaches when it has been thought through to its actual foundation. Lincoln was 54 years old. The war had 2 more years to run. The work, as he had said in the cemetery, was unfinished. Chapter 16. Grant and the War's Turning. Ulysses Grant was 5 feet 8 inches tall and wore a private's coat with lieutenant general's stars attached because he had not gotten around to acquiring a proper uniform. He had failed at farming. He had failed at a series of civilian occupations in the years before the war's outbreak. In 1861, he had been working in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, at 39 years old, with a reputation that the Army had not thought worth preserving. What the war revealed in him was a specific fitness for the conditions that the conflict created, a capacity for decision under pressure that did not require the pressure to resolve before the decision was made. He had a willingness to accept casualties that previous commanders had treated as reasons to stop. He possessed an understanding of the war's strategic geography that operated at a scale most of his contemporaries could not quite hold in mind. Fort Donelson in February 1862 had been the first evidence that a different kind of general was operating in the Western theater. Grant's demand for unconditional surrender, the initials of his name converted by the Northern newspapers into a slogan, had produced both the surrender and the phrase. The phrase had given Lincoln a name to remember at a moment when the Eastern Theater was still being managed by McClellan's caution. Shiloh in April 1862 had been messier. 2 days of fighting that produced approximately 23,000 combined casualties. The Northern newspapers had demanded Grant's relief on the grounds that he had been surprised and nearly destroyed. Lincoln had declined to relieve him. He said he could not spare the man. He fought. The Vicksburg campaign was among the most skillfully conducted operations of the entire conflict. Grant had moved his army south along the Mississippi's western bank and crossed the river below Vicksburg on a naval convoy. He cut loose from his supply lines entirely for 17 days, feeding his army from the Mississippi countryside while his subordinates argued that this was not how armies were supposed to function. He won 5 engagements in those 17 days and arrived before Vicksburg with the Confederate garrison trapped inside. The garrison of approximately 30,000 men surrendered on the 4th of July. The Mississippi River was open from its source to its mouth for the first time. Lincoln wrote Grant a letter after Vicksburg that was unusual in its directness about his own prior doubts. He told Grant that he had feared the river crossing scheme would fail, and that Grant had been right and he had been wrong. The letter was the work of a man who recognized the quality he had not found in McDowell or McClellan, a willingness to commit to a course of action and sustain it through the reverses that all courses of action encountered. Grant was appointed General-in-Chief of the United States Armies in March 1864. He came to Washington for the ceremony that formalized the appointment. The White House reception drew an unusually large crowd, all pressing toward the new general with the specific energy of people who wanted to be near the man they believed would end the war. Grant was genuinely uncomfortable with crowds and with the social performance that Washington events required. Lincoln spotted the situation and moved through the crowd toward him, steering him gently toward a position with more space. The two men had a brief conversation before the evening's obligations separated them again. They would not see each other frequently in the months that followed. Grant established his headquarters in the field with the Army of the Potomac. Traveling with Meade's army rather than operating from Washington suited both men. Lincoln understood that a general who needed to be in Washington was not a general who was winning. Grant understood that proximity to the political center was not an asset for someone trying to conduct a campaign. They communicated by telegraph, and the communications had a quality of directness, brevity, and mutual confidence. The Overland Campaign began on May 4, 1864, when Grant moved the Army of the Potomac across the Rapidan River into the tangled Virginia wilderness. What followed was unlike anything the Eastern Theater had yet produced, a sustained offensive in which Grant refused to disengage after each costly engagement. He moved by the left flank after each battle, pressing southward toward Richmond and forcing Lee to keep pace. He accepted casualties on a scale that the Northern newspapers found appalling and that Grant absorbed as the necessary arithmetic of ending the war. The Wilderness, May 7. Approximately 18,000 Union casualties in forests so dense that regiments lost their orientation. Grant ordered the army south rather than north. Spotsylvania Courthouse, May 21. Another 18,000 Union casualties over 2 weeks of fighting. This included the assault on the Bloody Angle, where forces fought at point-blank range for nearly 20 hours in the rain. Grant continued south. Cold Harbor, June 1-3. Approximately 7,000 Union casualties in the first hour of an assault. Grant would later say he regretted this decision. The Army continued south, crossing the James River and arriving before Petersburg, the rail junction south of Richmond, in mid-June. The Siege of Petersburg began in June 1864 and would last until April 1865. Lee's army was entrenched in a line that extended for miles south and west of the city. Grant's army extended alongside it, the two forces locked in a static confrontation. Grant understood this as the progressive exhaustion of Confederate resources that the South could not sustain. William Tecumseh Sherman had moved from Chattanooga toward Atlanta in early May. The same week, Grant crossed the Rapidan. The two campaigns were coordinated expressions of simultaneous pressure that prevented the Confederacy from shifting forces. Sherman's campaign through Georgia was slower and more methodical, a series of flanking movements that kept the Confederate Army falling back toward Atlanta. Hood attacked and lost heavily in a series of engagements, and by September the city had fallen. Philip Sheridan swept through the Shenandoah Valley in the late summer and autumn of 1864. He destroyed the agricultural infrastructure that had fed Confederate forces and denied Lee the ability to use the valley. The Valley Campaign was prosecuted with a relentlessness that earlier in the war would have been considered excessive. It was understood as the only approach that could end the conflict before the Northern electorate ended the government. Because by August 1864, the Northern electorate's patience was not a given. Chapter 17. The Long Election of 1864. The exhaustion of the summer of 1864 was not a metaphor. It was the ambient condition of a country that had been at war for 3 years. It had absorbed approximately 360,000 Union dead by that point in the conflict. It was reading casualty lists from the Overland campaign in its morning newspapers every day. The lists through May and June carried a cumulative weight that the earlier years of the war had not quite prepared it for. Grant's refusal to disengage from Lee had produced results that were strategically sound and politically dangerous simultaneously. The Army of the Potomac was closer to Richmond than it had ever been. Lee's army was being ground down in ways that could not be sustained indefinitely. The Northern public was looking at 65,000 casualties in 6 weeks. They were asking whether the man in the White House had any intention of stopping. Lincoln read the newspapers. He understood, with the political intelligence of someone who had been counting votes since the Illinois legislature, that the ground beneath his re-election was shifting. The military situation alone could not stabilize it. The Republican Party's radical wing was restless. The Wade-Davis bill, passed by Congress in July, had proposed a Reconstruction framework considerably more demanding than Lincoln's own 10% plan. It required 50% of a Confederate state's voters to take a loyalty oath before the state could be readmitted. It reflected the radicals' conviction that the rebellious states needed to be remade thoroughly. Lincoln pocket vetoed the bill, allowing it to expire unsigned rather than signing it or vetoing it directly. This constitutional mechanism avoided a formal confrontation while achieving the same result. Benjamin Wade and Henry Winter Davis responded with a public manifesto in August. Published in Horace Greeley's Tribune, it accused Lincoln of exceeding his constitutional authority. It appeared in August of a presidential election year. Salmon Chase had been maneuvering toward a presidential challenge since the beginning of 1864. He organized quietly through a series of letters to Republican activists. Lincoln had watched the maneuvering with the patience he brought to most political situations he could not immediately resolve. When the effort collapsed in March, Lincoln accepted Chase's pro forma resignation letter but declined to act on it. He continued using Chase's financial abilities while Chase continued harboring the ambitions that Lincoln did not find it useful to acknowledge. Horace Greeley had convinced himself by July 1864 that the war could be ended through negotiation. He pressed Lincoln to send representatives to meet with Confederate agents in Niagara Falls. Lincoln agreed on the condition that any proposal include reunion and the abandonment of slavery. He knew the Confederate agents were not authorized to accept these terms. The Niagara Falls Initiative became a public demonstration that the Confederacy was not interested in peace on Union terms. Greeley was embarrassed. Lincoln was not. The deeper difficulty was military. Sherman had been moving toward Atlanta since May, and by August he had not taken it. Grant was entrenched before Petersburg with no immediate prospect of breaking through. Sheridan's Valley campaign had not yet produced its decisive results. The war appeared to have reached a stasis that the Northern public was interpreting as failure. The Democratic Party was preparing to nominate George McClellan on a platform calling for an armistice. On August 23rd, Lincoln called his cabinet together and asked each member to sign the back of a folded document without reading it. They signed, curious but compliant. Lincoln put the document away without telling them what it contained. It stated that it seemed exceedingly probable that the administration would not be reelected. It declared it would be Lincoln's duty to save the Union between the election and the inauguration. Lincoln had been told by party managers and state chairmen that the election was lost. He believed them. He wrote down what his obligation would be in that circumstance so that the document's authenticity could not be challenged. Atlanta fell on September 2, 1864. Sherman's telegram arrived in Washington on the evening of September 3. The effect on the Northern political landscape was immediate and measurable. The city had been taken. The Confederacy's most important industrial center was in Union hands. The war that had appeared to have stalled indefinitely had produced a result that demonstrated the stalling was temporary. The Democratic Party's armistice platform found the ground shifting beneath it. McClellan himself distanced himself from the armistice plank in his acceptance letter. Sheridan destroyed the Shenandoah Valley's agricultural capacity through September and October. Grant maintained the pressure on Lee at Petersburg. The Northern public's confidence moved with the military situation. Lincoln won the election of November 1864 by 212 electoral votes to McClellan's 21. He carried every northern state except New Jersey, Delaware, and Kentucky. Approximately 78% of the military vote went to Lincoln. The men doing the fighting believed the cause was worth continuing. Lincoln opened the sealed memo after the election and read it aloud to the cabinet. The members heard, for the first time, what they had signed in August. The document described a preparation for losing that had been made unnecessary by winning. The room was sobered by the recognition of how close the thing had been. The second inaugural address was delivered on March 4, 1865. Lincoln stood on the east front of the Capitol under a dome that was finally completed. The speech was short, approximately 700 words. Lincoln did not claim credit for the war's progress or promise quick victory. He took up the question of the war's cause and answered it with a directness that was startling. Both sides had prayed to the same God. Both sides had read the same Bible. He suggested that the war's length might be the price Providence determined for the offense of slavery, an offense that both the North and the South had participated in. The closing paragraph arrived without triumphalism, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He spoke of binding the nation's wounds and caring for those who had borne the battle. The language was policy stated in terms of a principle more durable than exhaustion. Frederick Douglass was in the crowd and made his way to the White House reception afterward. Lincoln took his hand and asked what he thought of the address. Douglass told him it was a sacred document. Lincoln said he was glad to hear it and that it had come to him that way. April was coming. The siege at Petersburg was loosening. The arithmetic of the thing was becoming visible to everyone, including Robert E. Lee. Chapter 18, April 1865. The Petersburg lines broke on April 2. Lee's army moved west through the night with Grant's army following in parallel. Richmond was evacuated by the Confederate government that same night. Jefferson Davis received the telegram during a Sunday church service and left the city by rail before dawn. The government of the rebellion was abandoning its capital after 4 years with the haste of people who understood it was ending. Confederate soldiers set fire to warehouses as they withdrew. When Union forces entered Richmond on the morning of April 3, they came into a city whose skyline was burning. Lincoln was at City Point, the Union supply base on the James River. He received word of Richmond's fall and decided to go and see it. He traveled up the James River by barge on the morning of April 4. He was accompanied by Admiral Porter and an escort of 12 sailors. Porter had wanted a larger escort, but Lincoln had said 12 was sufficient. The barge moved upriver toward the landing. The walk through Richmond covered approximately a mile, through streets where the fires of the previous night had left smoke hanging. The freed people of Richmond came out as Lincoln moved through the city. A woman knelt in the street before him. Lincoln asked her to rise, telling her he was not worthy of such a gesture. An elderly man pushed through the crowd to take Lincoln's hand, tears on his face. Lincoln was seen to be struggling with what the moment was doing to him. The Confederate Executive Mansion was unlocked. Lincoln walked through its rooms and sat briefly in Jefferson Davis's chair at Davis's desk. He sat there in silence for a moment before he rose and continued through the house. No one recorded what he said. The silence was its own statement. He returned to City Point and then to Washington as the pursuit of Lee's army moved toward its conclusion. Lee was moving west with approximately 35,000 men, trying to reach a rail connection that might allow him to turn south. Grant moved to cut him off, sending Sheridan's cavalry ahead to block the routes west. The Confederate Army's condition deteriorated with each day of the march. Men were falling out from exhaustion and hunger. The cohesion of 4 years was finally beginning to loosen. Appomattox Courthouse was a small village in central Virginia. It was there on the morning of April 9 that Lee sent a flag of truce to Grant. They met in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house. Grant arrived in his field uniform with mud on his boots. Lee wore his best uniform and carried a sword. The two men sat across from each other and worked out the terms of surrender. Grant later described the conversation as one of the saddest of his life. The terms Grant offered were generous. Confederate officers and men would be paroled and allowed to return to their homes. Men who owned horses or mules could keep them, because Grant said they would need them for the spring plowing. Lee read the terms, acknowledged them, and signed. When Lee rode out of the village, Grant ordered his men to stop firing celebratory artillery. The rebels were their countrymen again. Lincoln received word of the surrender on the evening of April 9. The city celebrated through the night with an energy that had been building for 4 years. He addressed a crowd on the evening of April 11. The speech was a careful discussion of Reconstruction policy and the question of black suffrage. John Wilkes Booth was in the crowd and heard the speech. He told his companion that this would be the last speech Lincoln ever made. The last cabinet meeting was held on the morning of April 14th, Good Friday. Lincoln mentioned a recurring dream of a vessel moving rapidly toward a dark shore. He told the cabinet he expected news from Sherman soon. The theater party that evening was not something Lincoln particularly wanted to attend. He was tired, and he had told Mary Todd that he did not feel like going out. But the appearance had been announced, and Lincoln understood the public expectation of a celebration. He went. Ford's Theater on 10th Street was a familiar venue. The presidential box was draped in flags. Lincoln and his party settled in as the comedy was underway. John Wilkes Booth had spent the day organizing a coordinated series of attacks. He intended to kill Lincoln, Vice President Johnson, and Secretary Seward simultaneously. Booth entered the box at approximately 10:15 in the evening. The shot was a single round from a derringer. Lincoln slumped forward. Booth vaulted from the box to the stage and ran. The audience took several seconds to understand what had happened. The confusion assembled into comprehension with a specific slowness. Charles Leal, an army surgeon, reached the box first. He found Lincoln unconscious and began the interventions that restored a pulse. Lincoln was carried across the street to the Peterson house and laid across a bed too short for his length. The doctors gathered through the night to monitor the dying. Mary Todd Lincoln sat in the parlor and came periodically to the room where her husband lay. Robert Todd Lincoln arrived and remained. Secretary Stanton established himself in the back parlor and began conducting the government's business. The government needed someone to lead, and Lincoln could no longer do it. The breathing grew slower through the night and stopped at 7:22 in the morning of April 15th, 1865. Lincoln was 56 years old. Stanton stood in the room with the others as the doctor confirmed the end. Stanton said the words that have come down through time. Now he belongs to the ages. The funeral train left Washington on April 21st, carrying Lincoln's body home to Springfield. The journey reversed the 1,600 miles he had made to the capital 4 years earlier. People stood along the tracks at all hours to watch it go by. At the major stops, the lines of people who came to pass before the casket ran for blocks. Hundreds of thousands came to see the face of the man they were still trying to understand. Springfield received him on May 3. The burial was at Oak Ridge Cemetery in a receiving vault. The ceremony concluded, and the spring continued. The Illinois fields were greening in the way that May brought to the prairie. The weather did what weather did without regard for what the country was going to have to figure out on its own. The land was still there. The rivers ran where they had always run. The seasons continued in their order. The country that Lincoln had held together went on into a future that was not yet imaginable. It was different from what it had been and carried forward the work that was not yet done. The train had brought him home. The April light lay across the Illinois ground. The rest was the long, slow work of time. The journey is complete. Rest well.